The grandfather paradox. Time, to most of us, flows in one direction. We are born, we grow, we live, and then one day we leave. This sense of direction, this forward current, shapes how we remember, how we plan, how we understand cause and effect. And yet, in the quiet corners of thought, in the long hours of speculation, a single question waits patiently. What happens if we go back? The grandfather paradox is one of the oldest and most troubling thought puzzles ever posed about time travel. It does not ask what it would be like to visit the past, or whether it is possible. It asks something far more difficult. If you could travel back in time and prevent your own grandfather from ever having children, what would become of you? This is not merely a riddle for storytellers or science fiction fans. It strikes at the very heart of how we understand logic, identity, and causation. It takes the simplest structure of a life, birth, parenthood, legacy, and gently removes one crucial link in the chain, leaving the entire structure suspended in uncertainty. In its most well-known form, the paradox is framed like this. A time traveler goes back to a time before his grandfather had children. For whatever reason, perhaps by accident, perhaps by intent, he causes the death of his grandfather, or prevents the meeting between his grandparents, or alters the course of events so dramatically that his parents are never born. And yet, if his parents were never born, then he could never be born. If he was never born, then he could never have traveled back in time. If he never traveled back, then his grandfather's life would not have been interfered with, and the traveler would have been born after all. And so the cycle begins again, like a clock whose hands wind backward into silence and then forward into noise, caught forever in contradiction. This paradox does not simply challenge the possibility of time travel, it challenges the integrity of cause and effect. In the world we know, causes lead to outcomes. You turn the key and the engine starts. You lift your hand and the glass falls. But in the grandfather paradox, the effect destroys its own cause. The traveler erases the conditions that made his own existence possible, and in doing so erases his capacity to interfere in the first place. No answer resolves this paradox fully. No theory makes it comfortable. It remains where it has always been, suspended at the edge of logic, waiting without urgency, asking its question with infinite patience. And in the silence that follows, we begin to feel the gentle rhythm of thought slowing, the restless turning of questions growing quiet, and the sense that even the most impossible ideas can become soft enough to fall asleep beside. The bootstrap paradox. There is a kind of stillness in questions that never resolve, an echo that does not fade but folds inward, becoming quieter, deeper, more curious. The bootstrap paradox is one such question. It does not scream for attention. It does not break the rules of logic outright. Instead, it gently twists the idea of origin until the very concept becomes hard to hold. Where did it begin? That is the first and final question of the bootstrap paradox. Where did it begin? A person, an object, a thought, a piece of knowledge. All of them, in this paradox, seem to exist, fully formed, without ever having been created. The paradox is sometimes called the ontological paradox, and its structure is deceptively simple. Something appears to exist in time with no identifiable point of origin. A notebook, for example, is discovered in the past. It contains detailed designs for a machine. A young inventor finds it, studies it, builds the machine, and becomes famous. Later in life, the same inventor travels back in time and leaves the notebook in the very place where they found it as a child. The notebook was always there. But who wrote it? This is the loop. The notebook seems to have no beginning. It was not written by anyone. It was passed backward in time and forward again, endlessly repeating itself, existing without creation. It is its own source. It is its own consequence. The name bootstrap comes from an old phrase, pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps. It suggests a thing sustaining itself, lifting itself into existence without support. In the paradox, the object, or the information, has done just that. It comes from nowhere. It is passed from one point in time to another, but at no point is it ever truly created. This is not just an issue of objects. The paradox applies equally to people, ideas, songs, inventions, and words. A person could meet their older self, learn something vital, grow up, and later teach that same thing to their younger self. The knowledge continues. But no one ever discovered it. It has no author. This kind of loop is deeply unsettling because it violates our fundamental assumption that everything must come from somewhere, that things begin, grow, and end. The bootstrap paradox offers an alternative, one where origin is not a requirement, where something can be real and consistent and repeated, and still have no beginning. In this, it differs from the grandfather paradox. There, the contradiction is violent and obvious, an effect erasing its cause. Here, the contradiction is quiet, there is no deletion, everything fits. The timeline continues uninterrupted, but when you stop and ask where it all started, there is no answer. And so, the bootstrap paradox does not explode with contradiction. It lingers. It sits quietly in the corner of the mind, waiting for the question to be asked again. Where did it begin? No origin, no discovery, no invention. Just a perfect loop, closed and complete. A circle drawn without a starting point. A whisper that has always been there. As the mind tries to follow it again and again, the thoughts grow softer, the edges less sharp, and the question, though never answered, grows less demanding. The silence becomes thicker, deeper, and the paradox, still unresolved, remains folded quietly in the space where sleep begins. The predestination. Paradox. Time is often thought of as a path we walk, straight, narrow, unfolding only in one direction. We look ahead to what is unknown and back to what has been. We make choices, or so it seems, steering ourselves left or right, weighing one moment against the next. But what if choice is an illusion? What if every turn was already written long before you reached it? The predestination paradox is the quiet suggestion that all your actions, even the ones that seem spontaneous, have already happened. That your journey through time, however complex, however delayed, is not changing anything at all. You were always going to do what you did, even if it felt like a choice. This paradox begins with a traveler, not someone seeking to undo the past or to reinvent the future, but someone caught in a loop where their attempt to change something becomes the very cause of what they were trying to prevent. A person goes back in time to stop a tragedy, perhaps a fire, or an assassination, or a war. They act swiftly and with resolve, and their actions, despite all intention, directly lead to the very event they tried to stop. Their intervention becomes the trigger. They have not escaped the loop, they have fulfilled it. This is not a paradox of contradiction, it is a paradox of inevitability. There are no logical violations. No effect erases its cause. Instead, cause and effect form a circle so tightly sealed that nothing can escape it. Every choice, every consequence leads only to what was already destined. The traveler thinks they are disrupting the timeline. In truth, they are reinforcing it. And that is where the paradox reveals its deeper tension. We think of free will as the ability to intervene, to redirect, to choose one path over another. But if your future self goes back in time to cause your own actions, then who truly made the choice? Did you decide? Or were you always going to? In this view of time, events are fixed. The timeline is immutable. The past cannot be changed, not because something will stop you, but because you are already part of it. You have always been. Every action you take in the past is already accounted for. Every change you try to make is not a change at all, but a fulfillment. This kind of loop raises subtle and disquieting questions about identity. If the traveler becomes the cause of the event, then they are not just responding to history, they are part of its foundation. The origin and the result are woven together, indistinguishable. And in that certainty, even the most restless thoughts begin to slow. The urge to analyze, to predict, to regret fades. There is nothing to fix, nothing to change, nothing to undo. The traveler will always arrive. The moment will always occur. The circle will always close. And in that silence where resistance vanishes, the mind grows still. The questions stop reaching outward. The need to know softens into the need to rest. And the paradox without resolution becomes a cradle. And the cradle becomes sleep. The Hitler paradox. In the long corridors of time travel thought experiments, there is a door that is always found, but rarely opened without hesitation. Behind it waits one of the most controversial questions ever asked of the concept. If you could travel back in time and kill Adolf Hitler before his rise to power, would you do it? And deeper still, what would happen if you did? This is not a question about morality. It is not a fantasy of vengeance or an indulgence in alternate justice. It is a paradox, a logical dilemma, one that pulls at the delicate threads of cause and consequence, asking not whether we should change the past, but whether the past can be changed at all. The Hitler paradox, often called the time traveler's dilemma, poses a simple scenario. A person goes back in time to eliminate Adolf Hitler before he can instigate the Second World War and its unimaginable toll on humanity. The intent is to prevent disaster, to rewrite history into something less violent, less tragic. But if the mission is successful, if Hitler is removed early, then the war never happens. The Holocaust never occurs. Millions are never lost. And the future from which the time traveler originated ceases to exist. And if that future never existed, then the time traveler would have had no reason, no context, and no motivation to go back in time at all. This creates a dislocation, an unraveling. The action erases the reason for its own existence, and that, at its heart, is the paradox. And so the paradox endures. Not as a challenge to our morality, but as a mirror held up to the limits of power. The desire to change the past is deeply human, but time, it seems, is not something we can correct like a sentence or a sketch. It resists rewriting, not out of cruelty, but out of complexity. Perhaps that is what the paradox is meant to show us. Not that change is impossible, but that understanding is incomplete, that the past is too tightly woven, too deeply rooted, to be plucked free without consequence. And as that thought lingers, as the threads of cause and consequence fade softly into silence, the urgency of the question falls away. The dilemma does not need an answer today. The mind may release it. The door to that corridor of thought closes gently, and in the hush that follows, the logic softens, and the mind slows. The paradox remains where it belongs, in thought, not action, unsolved, but no longer urgent. And through that calm, time drifts on, without resistance. The Polchinski paradox. Among the many questions asked of time, there are some that do not begin with philosophy or storytelling, but with physics. Clean, structured, mathematical. These questions do not appeal to our emotions, our sense of regret, or moral urgency. They speak instead to the mechanical, to motion, to matter. And from these, another paradox emerges, quiet, subtle, and no less perplexing than any before it. The Polchinski paradox is named not for a traveler or a tyrant, but for a theoretical physicist. Joseph Polchinski proposed it in 1990 as a test case for closed time-like curves, paths in space-time that allow for movement into the past. He posed it not with human beings or events, but with a simple object, a billiard ball. The thought experiment goes like this. Picture a table, smooth, flat, unchanging. On it, a single billiard ball launched toward a wormhole, a theoretical structure in space-time that can connect two distant points. The ball rolls forward, enters the wormhole, and emerges in the past, just moments before it first approached. But this time, the ball exits in such a way that it collides with its earlier self, knocking it off course, preventing it from ever entering the wormhole in the first place. Here lies the paradox. If the ball enters the wormhole and emerges in the past to stop itself, then it will never go into the wormhole to begin with. And if it never goes in, then it cannot emerge to stop itself. But if it does not stop itself, it goes in. And around the loop we go. The Polchinski paradox is unique in its precision. It is not built around complex human behavior or unforeseeable psychological factors. It's built on geometry, on movement, on a hard object obeying the rules of physics. And that is what makes it so deeply troubling to scientists. There are no variables to blame. No intention, no confusion, no hesitation. Just motion and contradiction. The paradox remains, but the tension softens. And with it, so does everything else. The Novikov self-consistency principle. There is a comfort in patterns, a quiet reassurance in knowing that even the strangest ideas are still bound to some kind of rule. When thoughts spiral through uncertainty, when logic begins to stretch, there is still value in finding a framework that holds. And in the world of time travel paradoxes, few ideas offer a more structured sense of order than the Novikov self-consistency principle. At its core, this principle is not a story. It is not a mystery or a dilemma. It is a rule, a boundary drawn not by speculation, but by necessity. It exists to prevent contradiction, not by preventing time travel, but by defining what time travel must become in order to make sense. Formulated by Russian physicist Igor Dmitrievich Novikov in the 1980s, the principle proposes a single, powerful idea. If an event exists that would give rise to a paradox or change the past, then the probability of that event is exactly zero. In simpler terms, the past is self-protecting. You can travel through time. You can interact with the world. But whatever you do must be consistent with history as it already is. There is no allowance for contradiction. If something did not happen, then it cannot be made to happen. If something did happen, then it cannot be undone. Every action taken by a time traveler, no matter how unusual or improbable, must align with what history already reflects. This is not a restriction placed by technology or by fate. It is a logical safeguard, a principle meant to hold the timeline together, not by force but by probability, and its implications are far-reaching. Under this principle, events are not rigidly determined by some external force. They are not ordained, they are simply consistent. A traveler may go back in time and try to prevent a disaster, but if that disaster already happened, then every attempt to stop it must fail. Not by chance, but by necessity. The failure is part of what keeps the timeline coherent. This offers a striking reinterpretation of historical inevitability, not as destiny, but as a structural consequence of logic. The past cannot be rewritten, not because someone says it can't, but because reality refuses to contradict itself. And this leads to an unsettling kind of choreography. In the Novikov framework, the actions of a time traveler are not random. They are constrained to fit the puzzle of history. If you interact with the past, your actions must already be part of the past. They cannot disrupt the outcome. They must be folded into it. Take a simple example. A scientist builds a time machine and sends a message to the past, hoping to prevent a major scientific error. But if that error occurred, and if the past contains no record of the message, then the message cannot arrive. Or it may arrive in a form that is misunderstood, or dismissed, or too late. No matter the intention, the outcome will remain intact. This may sound limiting, but it also brings a curious kind of freedom. It means that time travel does not tear the fabric of the universe apart. It means that timelines are not fragile, they are resilient, flexible, but not breakable. Events may fold, loop, or ripple, but they will never contradict. And here lies the quiet power of Novikov's idea. It replaces paradox with permission. It says, yes, you may travel through time, yes, you may act, but your actions are not yours alone. They are part of something larger, a pattern, a closed, harmonious story in which everything fits. This principle has been explored in both theoretical physics and fictional narratives, and it often yields the same result, a sense of elegant containment. A timeline in which all events, even the strangest ones, reinforce each other. There is no disruption, only interdependence. And what remains is not a riddle, but a rhythm. And the rhythm continues, slow, patient, and peaceful. The free will paradox in time travel. There is a stillness that arrives when we consider the choices we make, the small ones, the large ones, and all the quiet ones in between. We believe that we choose, that we select one path and not another, that our actions belong to us, that we are not puppets moved by forces beyond our sight, but minds steering bodies, deciding futures, shaping outcomes. But when time travel enters the conversation, something about that sense of choice begins to tremble. Not because the traveler changes the future, not even because they alter the past, but because the very act of moving through time puts every choice under question. This is the free will paradox in time travel. It is not a contradiction of physics. It is not a flaw in storytelling. It is a conflict between how we experience agency and what time travel might say about it. The paradox begins with a traveler, a person who knows the future, either because they've been there or because they've read it, seen it, lived it. Perhaps they read a journal written decades ahead, or witness a moment they have not yet reached, or meet someone who tells them what they will one day do. And now, knowing what is coming, they try to resist it. They make different decisions, avoid the places they're told they will go, change their relationships, reroute their path. But somehow, each attempt to alter the course only leads them back to where the future said they would be. Every detour becomes part of the road. Every refusal folds into fulfillment. And the more they try to escape what they know, the more the outcome begins to feel inevitable. This is not a loop, not a contradiction. It is a realization that perhaps, in the presence of time travel, free will becomes a kind of illusion. That knowing the future fixes the future. That whatever you do, whether you resist or accept, your actions were always part of the timeline. And that is where the paradox grows cold and quiet. Because if you were always going to act a certain way, even if it felt like your choice, was it ever your choice at all? The mind wrestles with this gently. It wants to hold on to the sense of control, to believe that knowing what will happen does not determine it, that a person can step off the track, break the pattern, change the end. But in a world where time can be traveled, where futures can be visited, the shape of time begins to fold, and choice becomes not an open field, but a sequence, already written, already known. It is unsettling, but not unfamiliar. Even in our daily lives, we encounter echoes of this paradox. A choice that feels spontaneous, but was shaped by hundreds of influences. A decision we make freely, but that someone else predicted with perfect accuracy. The free will paradox in time travel sharpens that feeling. It asks, if all of time exists, if every moment is already part of the record, can anything be truly chosen? One response is to say that time is fixed, that the past, present, and future exist simultaneously, like chapters in a finished book. You may read them in order. You may reread or skip ahead, but the words are already printed, and the traveler, moving through time, cannot change the story. They can only move through it. Another response is to hold on to uncertainty, to say that perhaps the future is only one of many possibilities, that what the traveler sees is a potential, not a certainty, that free will still exists, but only if the timeline is flexible. But the paradox arises when the traveler sees not a vague outline, but a detailed account, a future with specifics, names, actions, moments, and then, despite every effort to change course, ends up fulfilling it word for word. If the timeline can be observed, and if the observation matches the outcome, then the conclusion is soft but inescapable. The freedom to choose has boundaries drawn by time, and yet, not all freedom must vanish. The paradox remains, the question remains, but the urgency fades. You are here, you have acted, you will act again. And in that quiet rhythm, the need to understand gives way to rest. Thought softens, doubt dissolves, the loop closes, not with a lock, but with a whisper, and the whisper becomes stillness, and the stillness becomes sleep. The causal loop paradox. There is something deeply tranquil about a circle. It does not begin, it does not end, it does not accelerate or decelerate, it simply returns. The loop, by nature, has no sharp edge, no sudden shift. It flows into itself quietly, continuously, like a river that forgets where it started and learns only to follow its own curve. In the world of time travel, there is a concept shaped exactly like that. The causal loop paradox. A paradox not born from contradiction but from closure. It does not tear logic apart. It wraps logic around itself so tightly and so smoothly that the beginning and end blur together. The paradox unfolds like this. An event in the future causes something in the past, and that past event then causes the very future that created it. Round and round, the cause and the effect circle each other until neither can be said to truly come first. There is no contradiction here, only a loop, a perfect chain, where every link exists because the next one does, and vice versa. But the unsettling beauty of the causal loop lies in this simple question: where did it start? The answer, always, is nowhere, or perhaps everywhere at once. Consider the example of an object. A man receives a watch from a stranger in the street. It is old, worn, familiar somehow. Years later, the man travels back in time, and finding himself unable to carry it forward, hands it off to a younger version of himself, completing the loop. The watch has always been passed forward by being passed backward. It was never made, it was never purchased, it simply exists, forever. Another version of the paradox uses information. A scientist receives notes containing a breakthrough theory, equations that change everything. She builds her reputation on them, teaches them, publishes them, and eventually, before her final days, sends them backward in time to her younger self. The notes never had an author. They were never discovered, and yet they remain true. In a causal loop, the timeline does not break. It doesn't ripple or branch, it stabilizes. What has happened will always happen. What will happen has already occurred. There is no freedom to alter, only repetition, only fulfillment. And yet, despite its stability, the loop resists explanation. Because what we expect, what we are conditioned to believe, is that every cause should have a clear beginning. That effects come from something original, that everything must emerge from somewhere. The causal loop quietly refuses. It says, perhaps not. Perhaps some things exist not because they began, but because they are entangled in time so deeply that they cannot be separated from it. The origin is not behind them, it is within them. This idea invites a different kind of reflection, a slowing of urgency, a pause in the search for origin, because in the loop there is no origin to find, and in that possibility the mind becomes still. There is no longer a need to track the chain, to identify the first link. The loop is whole. It has always been. There is no hurry, no push, only motion returning gently to itself. Thought begins to move slower now, no longer grasping, no longer analyzing. The paradox has no edge, no point to press against, only a curve, and that curve begins to feel like rest. The no-beginning paradox. There are questions that echo not because they are loud, but because they are quiet. Questions that return not with urgency but with rhythm, gentle, persistent, unresolvable. The no-beginning paradox, often known as the information loop, is one of those questions. It does not seek to surprise or alarm. It simply asks, where did the first idea come from? And then it waits. This paradox is subtle. It does not shout for attention. It drifts into awareness like a feather landing on still water. But the weight it carries grows heavier the longer you sit with it. Because it isn't just about time, it's about meaning and the trace of origin. Here is how it unfolds. A writer, living in the future, discovers a manuscript. It is brilliant, complete, untouched by error. They study it, absorb it, and eventually publish it under their own name. Decades later, after years of success and imitation, they grow older and more private. Then, one day, they send the manuscript back in time, placing it where they know their younger self will find it. The loop is closed. The manuscript is passed from one version of the writer to another, unbroken. But then the paradox reveals itself, not in what was done, but in what was not. The manuscript has no true origin. It was never written, not from a blank page, not from an initial spark of thought. It was received, it was passed on, but it was never created. This is the information loop, knowledge without a source. An idea that exists only because it was given to someone who would one day give it back. It defies our understanding of intellectual lineage. It severs the chain of thought from its beginning. Where did the information come from? Nowhere, or from itself. And this troubles the logical mind because we are trained to think in sequences, to believe that knowledge builds upon knowledge, that the first word leads to the second, that every sentence is born of an impulse, a reason, a need, that behind every invention is an inventor, behind every insight a mind. But in the information loop, that expectation dissolves. The loop becomes the author. The cycle becomes the source. The concept has been studied in physics, philosophy, and information theory. Some versions involve machines. Others involve messages, technologies, formulas. A device is found, reverse-engineered, then sent back to be found again. A mathematical proof is solved not by logic, but by memory. A theory is taught by those who only ever learned it from themselves. And in every case, the same paradox rises slowly into view. This information exists, but it was never discovered. It was never reasoned out. It was never earned. It simply is. This is what makes the no-beginning paradox uniquely quiet, uniquely haunting. It doesn't interrupt time. It fills it with something that should not be there, and yet cannot be removed. An idea that belongs but does not trace. It asks us to consider the value of information that exists purely because it exists, not earned, not discovered, only sustained, perpetuated, repeated. And here, in this suspended space of logic, the mind begins to slow. Because the paradox does not challenge with confusion, it drains the need for explanation. Where did it begin? That question no longer demands an answer. The loop doesn't need one. The loop exists because it always has, and that truth, impossible as it seems, becomes oddly calming. Perhaps not all things need a beginning, perhaps some things simply are. A song, humming across time, a sentence echoing forever. Not because it was spoken, but because it was heard. And in that endless echo, the thinking slows. Not because the question is solved, but because it no longer insists on being solved. The loop carries itself forward. Thought settles. The weight of needing to know lifts. And what remains is not the need to find the first spark, but the gentle glow of stillness. No beginning, no burden, just continuity, and continuity becomes rest. The chicken or the egg time loop. Some questions linger in our collective consciousness, not because they offer answers, but because they refuse to be answered at all. They circle gently in thought, asking not to be solved, but to be observed. One such question, passed down through cultures and centuries, is the deceptively simple riddle. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? For most, this question is a playful thought, a clever way to test circular logic or to spark casual debate. But within the context of time travel, the question transforms. It becomes heavier, more intricate. It becomes a paradox. Specifically, it becomes a demonstration of what happens when cause and effect are folded into a perfect, self-contained loop. A loop with no identifiable beginning. In this paradox, the scenario is extended into the realm of temporal mechanics. A traveler from the future carries with them an object, a fertilized egg. They arrive in the past, at a time before the species exists, and deposit the egg into an incubator. The egg hatches. The creature grows, reproduces, and over generations gives rise to the species the traveler originally knew. Eventually, scientists from this timeline study the genetics of the species, sequence its DNA, and replicate the process that leads to the creation of the original egg. That egg is then given to a future traveler to be taken back once more. And just like that, the loop is complete. There is no point in this cycle that can be identified as the beginning. The egg exists because of the chicken. The chicken exists because of the egg. They sustain each other across time, passing their existence forward and backward in a closed circuit of causation. And yet, neither was created in the traditional sense. There was no originator, no first moment, only a loop. What makes this paradox so quietly disturbing is not its complexity, but its simplicity. We expect things to start somewhere. We're taught to trace ideas, life, and objects back to an original source. Everything, we believe, must be rooted in a moment of creation. The chicken comes from the egg, but the egg must come from somewhere older, something that wasn't quite a chicken. But in a time loop, that reasoning unravels. Instead of a linear sequence, we are presented with a cycle. Self-sustained, endlessly recursive, and entirely detached from the traditional idea of beginnings. This same structure can be applied beyond biology. Information, technology, art, even identity can be looped in time. A person reads a groundbreaking book, travels back in time, and gives it to its supposed author. That author then publishes it, inspired by the very words they were given. The loop is unbroken. The knowledge was never created. It simply exists. And once the urgency to find a starting point is gone, so too is the restlessness. The question fades into quiet. The loop softens its edges. The paradox no longer demands clarity. It only offers rhythm. A rhythm with no first beat. A dance with no first step. A thought that drifts endlessly in circles until it becomes still. And in that stillness, sleep begins to settle. The many worlds, time. Travel paradox. The mind seeks unity. It longs for a single thread. One line to follow from cause to effect, from choice to outcome. One life, one world, one timeline. This longing is natural. It simplifies the chaos. It turns an overwhelming flood of possibility into something we can carry. But in quantum mechanics and in time travel speculation, this simplicity begins to dissolve. That single thread phrase, and in its place emerges something far more complex yet strangely elegant. A universe not singular, but plural. A fabric not woven from one strand, but from countless parallel threads, each diverging, branching, continuing endlessly. This is the foundation of the many worlds time travel paradox. To understand the paradox, one must begin with the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics. It proposes that every event with multiple possible outcomes causes reality to split. Not metaphorically, but literally. At the moment of divergence, whether it's the spin of a particle or the decision to speak or stay silent, two or more versions of the universe are created. One for each possibility. Every path is followed. Every choice made. Every variation realized. In this framework, time travel takes on a radically different meaning. A traveler, stepping backward into the past, does not return to their own history. They enter a parallel version, one that looks the same at first, but quickly diverges. The past they see is not their past, and the future they influence will not be their future. Their own timeline remains untouched, sealed behind them like a door they cannot reopen. And here is where the paradox begins. Let's say the traveler intends to change something. Perhaps they return to stop a tragedy, to save a loved one, or to prevent an invention from being misused. They act with care and precision, succeeding in altering the course of events. But upon trying to return, they find that their original timeline has not changed at all. The people they wanted to save are still lost. The outcome they tried to avoid remains intact. Why? Because the timeline they changed is not the one they came from. It is a parallel version, almost identical yet separate. Their own world, their own history continues without interruption. Their success is real, but it is not personal. They have healed a wound in another branch, not in their own. This introduces an emotional dimension to the paradox that is quietly disorienting. The traveler can make a difference, but not where they hoped. Not for the people they knew. The impact is undeniable, but it belongs to another version of reality. They return to a world unchanged, holding only the knowledge that somewhere else, someone was spared, and that it was not here. There is a quiet sorrow in that, a strange feeling of being both powerful and powerless. You can save a life, but not the one you meant to save. You can correct a mistake, but not in the story you remember. You are displaced, not just in space or time, but in consequence. Some interpret this paradox as a kind of mercy. In the many worlds model, no action is futile. Every decision ripples through some timeline. Every effort matters somewhere. Nothing is lost. But for the traveler, this diffusion of meaning can be disquieting. They must accept that their actions resonate not in the world they left behind, but in worlds they can never truly know. Others embrace the multiplicity. They see it not as loss, but as abundance. An infinite canvas of realities, each a playground for variation. A multiverse in which time travel becomes less about correction and more about exploration. You do not go back to fix, you go sideways to witness, to participate, to observe the world not as it was, but as it might have been. And yet, even in that abundance, the paradox remains. If every timeline exists, then which one is real? If every version of you exists, then which one are you? If your identity can fracture and reassemble across infinite paths, does the self become thinner, less anchored? Or does it stretch into something more resilient, more open? The many worlds time travel paradox is not loud. It does not crash into logic or tear history apart. It hums quietly beneath the surface of choice. It asks whether the world you save is ever really your own, and whether your memories, your motivations, your hopes belong only to one version of you, or to all of them. And when the question has echoed long enough, when it has circled and softened, something begins to loosen. The need to be singular fades. The pressure to change one world gives way to the possibility of touching many, not to fix, not to control, just to move gently through a garden of variations, where each path matters, even if you cannot walk them all. And in that garden, time flows differently. Less like a river, more like rain, falling in many directions. Software continuous and quietly still. The quantum suicide paradox. There are moments in thought where the line between science and philosophy begins to blur, where the cold logic of quantum theory intersects with the deepest questions about life, death, and consciousness. These are not moments of chaos, but of quiet, unsettling stillness. Not because they scream, but because they whisper with a calm so unnatural that it demands reflection. The quantum suicide paradox exists at the edge of this stillness. It does not concern itself with causality loops or travelers interfering with history. Instead, it centers on the observer, the one who moves through time not with machines, but with thought. It is not about traveling backward or forward. It is about what it means to experience continuity when everything around you collapses, except you. This paradox begins in the world of quantum mechanics. At the subatomic level, particles behave in ways that defy traditional understanding. They exist in multiple states at once, a condition known as superposition. It is only when they are observed that they seem to collapse into one outcome. This is the framework behind the famous thought experiment known as Schrödinger's cat. A cat placed in a sealed box, its life or death tied to a random quantum event. Until the box is opened, the cat is both alive and dead, in overlapping realities. The quantum suicide paradox builds upon this, but with one crucial change. The observer is no longer watching the box. The observer is inside it. Think about this. A theoretical device is created based on a quantum event that has a 50% chance of killing the person who activates it, and a 50% chance of doing nothing. Each time the switch is flipped, quantum theory suggests that the universe splits, one branch where the person dies, and another where they survive. Now, suppose the observer repeats this test over and over. From the outside, there is a growing list of universes where the person has perished, but from the inside, they are always the one who survived. To that observer, death never arrives. Each time the device is activated, they continue on in the branch where they are still alive. To everyone else, it appears they are gone, but subjectively, their stream of consciousness never ends. They pass through each near-death moment into the only world where they still exist, again and again. This is where the paradox unfolds, not in the mechanics, but in the implications. If the observer always finds themselves surviving, does this mean they are immortal? If their awareness continues only in the branches where they live, is death ever truly experienced? And if so, for whom? The paradox doesn't claim that people don't die. It acknowledges that in countless branches of the universe, death is real and final. But it suggests that the self, the conscious mind, can only ever experience the thread in which it endures. Not because of willpower, not because of destiny, but because every other version fades from experience the moment it ends. This idea, while rooted in serious interpretations of quantum physics, feels far more like a mirror than a theory. A mirror that reflects back our most personal question: what happens when I reach the end? And then gently answers: you never do. You simply continue, where continuation is possible. But this continuation comes at a strange cost. In the worlds where you survive, you may be increasingly alone. The loved ones who once stood beside you may no longer exist in your branch. The world around you may diverge. You persist, but the price of persistence is disconnection. And in that realization, the paradox softens. It no longer promises comfort. It no longer threatens meaning. It simply presents a quiet model of awareness, one in which the self, by nature of its own consciousness, forever slips into the timelines where it remains intact. Is this immortality, or is it a dream of continuity wrapped in the mathematics of probability? The paradox does not offer an answer. It does not comfort or deny. It simply allows the mind to wander across infinite versions of survival, where the self continues not because it was chosen, but because it is the only perspective it can ever truly know. And as the mind sits with this gentle looping of survival through branches unknown, something begins to loosen. The fear of endings, the pressure of permanence begins to fade. Not everything must be explained. Not every version of the self must be held onto. There is a version of you, somewhere, still breathing, still walking, still asking questions, and somewhere else there is silence. But here, in this quiet moment, there is stillness, a sense that you do not need to run from the end, because you have always continued, wherever you could, and that continuation, soft and eternal, becomes rest. The Schrödinger's time traveler. Paradox. In the quiet places of thought, where the world is still and the mind is no longer chasing resolution, certain ideas begin to unfold in strange, layered ways. They are not loud, they do not shout their complexity. Instead, they arrive like fog, slowly, silently, revealing their depth only after you've already stepped inside. One of these ideas rests at the intersection of time travel and quantum uncertainty. It does not ask what happens to events or objects or decisions. It asks what happens to the traveler themselves when they are both here and not, known and unknown, present and postponed. This is the Schrödinger's time traveler paradox. To approach this paradox, we must begin not with machines or wormholes, but with the mind of Erwin Schrödinger, the Austrian physicist who gave us one of the most haunting metaphors in science. Schrödinger's cat. A cat sealed in a box, subjected to a quantum event. If the event occurs, the cat dies. If it does not, the cat lives. But until the box is opened and observed, the cat exists in a superposition, both alive and dead at once. A single being in two contradictory states, held in delicate quantum balance. Now, take that principle and apply it to a person. Not just any person, but one who travels through time. The paradox begins with a scenario in which the act of time travel is triggered by a quantum event. Something inherently uncertain, something that splits probabilities. A traveler steps into a device powered by a quantum condition. If the outcome tilts one way, they are sent to the past. If it tilts another, they remain in the present. No one knows which has occurred until time itself begins to reflect the outcome. But during the moment of transition, before the effects ripple through reality, the traveler is both gone and not gone, both present and missing, both in the past and in the now. The traveler, like the cat, exists in a superposition, and that is where the paradox begins to stretch. Think about a timeline where the traveler arrives in the past and begins to alter events. But simultaneously, in the present moment, there is uncertainty. Did they go? Did they stay? Their absence cannot yet be confirmed. Their influence is not yet felt. They are both part of the history unfolding, and still standing on the edge of it. They are the observer and the observed, the catalyst and the consequence, not in separate moments, but at once. In quantum mechanics, this state of uncertainty collapses when observed. A choice becomes known. A particle takes a path. But with time travel, the observation might come too late, or from a perspective that no longer exists. The traveler's presence in the past cannot be confirmed until the changes they make begin to surface. But by then, the conditions for that confirmation may already be rewritten. This is where logic begins to warp. Not with contradiction, but with silence. The traveler becomes unknowable, not because they are gone, but because they are suspended between timelines. Neither can confirm their presence without invalidating the other. They are lost in probability. And here the paradox begins to fold inward. What is identity when presence is uncertain? What does it mean to act if your action cannot be placed into time? What does it mean to exist when you do so in two incompatible narratives? And as the idea settles, the need for clarity drifts away. The boundaries blur, the moment slows, and in that slow, soft silence, where the traveler hovers between states, time becomes still, and stillness becomes sleep. Everett's branching worlds conflict. In the deeper layers of reality, there are ideas that do not disrupt the surface, but change the shape of everything beneath it. They do not startle the mind with noise or contradiction. They simply offer a different foundation, one that, once seen, makes everything familiar look slightly altered. One such idea was introduced in 1957, quietly, by a young physicist named Hugh Everett III. His idea would go on to reshape the way many think about time, probability, and the very structure of existence. It came to be known as the many worlds interpretation. But inside that idea, there lives a particular tension, a quiet paradox not often named aloud. This is Everett's branching worlds conflict. Unlike the standard time travel paradoxes that twist around causality, this one grows from abundance. It asks not what happens when time loops or contradicts itself, but what happens when it branches without end. What happens when, instead of one outcome, reality produces all outcomes? And what happens when every decision, every possibility, creates another version of the world? According to Everett's interpretation of quantum mechanics, the universe does not choose between outcomes. It embraces all of them. Every time an event occurs with more than one possible result, the universe splits. There is no collapse of probability, no final decision. Instead, each possibility exists in its own, fully realized branch. All are equally real. All are equally complete. A world where you turned left. A world where you stayed still. A world where the traveler arrived. A world where they never left. The consequence of this model is both expansive and deeply personal. It means that your life, the one you know, the one you remember, is one of countless variations. And while that knowledge may seem vast, it introduces a subtle conflict, not in the science but in the self. The conflict begins when time travel enters Everett's landscape. Suppose you travel back in time, expecting to change something, anything, but instead of altering your own timeline, you create a new one, a branch that flows independently from the moment you arrived. You remember where you came from, but you can never return to it. That version of reality continues elsewhere, unreachable, untouched by your intervention. And in the moment you change history, you have not corrected your past. You have created a parallel one, a world where the mistake was avoided, but where the consequences belong to someone else. This raises a strange and quiet conflict. The self you are in now is not the one who suffered the loss. The people you save are not the ones you lost. They are close, nearly identical, but they are not the same. And still, the traveler remembers. They remember the world they came from, the pain they carried, the reasons they crossed time at all. But those reasons now exist only in memory, no longer mirrored in the world around them. In this conflict, time travel becomes displacement, not physically but emotionally. The traveler becomes a ghost in a world that resembles their own, but is not their own. They have created a better history, but it is not the history they lived. And yet, the paradox does not end there. If every version of you exists somewhere, if every choice is lived fully by some branch, then what becomes of responsibility? What becomes of meaning if everything that could happen does? If a version of you always makes the right choice, and another always makes the wrong one, are either still yours? Some argue that Everett's branching gives us freedom, that every possibility means every path is open, that we are not trapped by one future, but surrounded by a million second chances. But others see something lonelier. They see a universe where connection becomes fragile, where the self becomes fractured across timelines, where every joy is matched by its opposite, every reunion mirrored by a loss, every success balanced by failure elsewhere. And yet, the branches grow, whether we accept them or not. Each one real, each one continuing, each one holding a version of events that might have been, or still are. This is the heart of Everett's conflict. The realization that in an infinite field of realities, identity must be more than circumstance. It must be rooted in the present moment, the only place where awareness truly resides, the only version of you will ever know completely. Perhaps the branches do not diminish meaning. Perhaps they hold it more delicately. Every choice, though echoed elsewhere, is still yours in the world you know. And that world, this moment, is where you are. The others exist, they bloom and fade in the distance, but they do not pull you apart. They remind you that each reality, no matter how small, is entire. Not lesser, not shadowed, but complete in itself. And that completeness, like a slow turning page, allows the mind to rest. Not everything must be known. Not every version must be reconciled. It is enough to be here, in this branch, now. And that gentle acceptance, unfolding without resistance, becomes quiet. And the quiet becomes sleep. The observer effect in time loops. Some truths don't emerge through movement, but through stillness. Not from acting, but from noticing. In the realm of physics, this quiet principle is known as the observer effect, the idea that the mere act of observing a system changes it. That reality, when watched too closely, begins to shift under the weight of attention. At first glance, this seems like a small, almost poetic curiosity. But when observation intersects with time, and with loops in time, it grows into something much more subtle, much more haunting. This is the observer effect in time loops. Time loops by nature are patterns, events repeating, folding back into themselves. A person wakes to the same morning again and again. A decision is made, only to be unmade by the return of the hour. A moment passes and then passes again. Within these loops there is repetition, but not always awareness. Now enter the observer. A person within the loop who knows, who remembers, who notices that time is folding. Their presence, their memory, their awareness becomes the only variable that changes with each repetition. And that variable, though quiet and unseen, begins to press against the loop itself. In theory, the loop should remain identical with each cycle. Events repeating flawlessly, conditions resetting perfectly. But the observer, carrying knowledge from one loop to the next, begins to alter the outcome by simply being aware. They do not need to act, they do not need to resist or interfere. Their memory alone creates disturbance. Like a single breath in a still room, it shifts the air. This is not a paradox in the traditional sense. There is no contradiction, no violation of physics. Instead, there is a soft unraveling of the loop's perfection. Consider a traveler trapped in a loop. At first, he follows the same path. He speaks the same words, he takes the same steps, but by the third loop, or the 7th, or the 100th, something changes. He hesitates. He glances in a different direction. He speaks with more caution, or less fear. He asks a question he did not ask before. Nothing monumental, nothing explosive, but enough. Because each of these small deviations, the result of growing observation, begins to pull the loop apart from its symmetry. The observer becomes the cause of change, not by force but by remembering. Their accumulated awareness distorts the pattern. And here the paradox reveals itself. A loop designed to repeat perfectly is undone by the one element it could not erase, the mind that watches it. What was meant to remain stable becomes adaptive. What was meant to be predictable becomes unstable. The loop, once a smooth circle, begins to warp. Not violently, not suddenly, but inevitably. This raises a question that lingers quietly beneath the surface. Can any loop survive observation? Is repetition ever truly flawless if there is even one witness who remembers? Or does every pattern, however precise, begin to decay the moment it is watched? This principle has profound implications for time travel. If loops can be broken not by machines or interventions, but by thought alone, then perhaps awareness is the most powerful force in time. Not technology, not force, not will, just the quiet unfolding of memory. And as this understanding deepens, the tension of repetition begins to fade. The loop no longer dominates, it softens, it loses its grip, because the power was never in the cycle, it was in the one who noticed it. And the one who noticed it begins to rest. Not because the loop was escaped, but because it was understood, and understanding, in its gentlest form, becomes peace. And peace, as always, becomes sleep. Wave function. Collapse paradox in time travel. There are ideas in quantum theory that resist shape. Concepts that cannot be held too tightly, or they begin to dissolve in the very hands that try to grasp them. One of the most delicate among these is the idea of the wave function, the mathematical representation of a quantum system in a state of uncertainty, a system not yet settled into a fixed outcome, not one thing, not another, but a blend of all possible realities. Now, take this fragile concept, this quiet cloud of uncertainty, and place it in the hands of a time traveler. Here begins the wave function collapse paradox in time travel. In the quantum world, particles do not behave like marbles or stones. They do not travel along defined paths with certainty. Instead, before measurement, they exist in a state of potential, a cloud of probability known as a superposition. The particle might be here, or there, or in 1,000 places at once. It is only when observed, only when measured, that the cloud collapses into a single, definite outcome. This moment is known as wave function collapse. Now, let's say that instead of observing a particle, the traveler observes an event, or more precisely, becomes part of it. Suppose they step into a moment of unresolved probability, a decision not yet made, a future not yet determined, a life balanced between paths. Their very presence becomes a form of measurement. By stepping into that moment, they collapse the wave. They force the universe to choose, to lock in one version of the story. But this choice, made by their arrival, was already supposed to have happened. The past, which once carried multiple futures, now carries only one, the one defined by the traveler's presence. And here the paradox begins. The traveler is observing something that, in their own history, has already collapsed. They remember it as a fixed moment, a settled event. But now they are stepping into it at a point before that collapse occurred. Their presence alters not just the outcome, but the very process of resolution. They are interfering with the measurement that led to the reality they remember, which leads to a contradiction. If their observation collapses the wave function in a way that results in a different outcome, then their original future, the one that led them back, never existed. The result that gave birth to the traveler is erased by their own observation, and if it is erased, they could never have returned. But if they never returned, the event collapses in its original form. And if it does, then they do return. And so the loop begins. Unlike other paradoxes grounded in cause and effect, this one exists in the tension between possibility and certainty. The traveler is not simply changing events, they are forcing one out of many. They are taking a cloud of futures and condensing it into a single path. And in doing so, they sever their connection to the world they came from. The paradox deepens when you realize that this collapse isn't just physical, it's informational. It affects what can be known, what can be remembered, what can be proven. By collapsing the wave, the traveler creates a world where only one outcome ever appears to have existed. The others vanish, not as failed alternatives, but as unmeasurable ghosts. The traveler, by observing, is rewriting what is knowable, not through lies, but through quantum truth. And for the traveler, that narrowing is personal. They do not just witness history, they shape it by witnessing it. Their memory becomes mismatched with the new version of events. Their identity, anchored in a future that no longer exists, begins to untether. They remember the outcome that never happened. They carry knowledge from a version of the past that no longer aligns with the present they've helped shape. In this dissonance, the self begins to drift. Not lost, not broken, but uncertain. Because if every time you observe, you alter, then where is the unchanging core? If every action redefines what is true, then what part of you remains untouched? And yet, even in this uncertainty, there is peace. Because the collapse of the wave is not destruction, it is decision. It is the world choosing one of many quiet possibilities. It is the fog lifting, not because it was wrong to be there, but because you have stepped into it. And what remains, once the collapse is done, is a single path. No longer perfect, no longer untouched, but real. And the traveler continues, not where they thought, but where they are. And in that soft adjustment, the questions fade. The need to hold on to all outcomes fades. What is left is enough. One thread, one moment, one version of now. And now is quiet. And the quiet becomes sleep. Entanglement across time. There are moments when reality feels tightly held together, moments when two things, separated by distance, circumstance, or even time itself, seem to move in quiet harmony. They respond to one another. They mirror each other. Not by force, not by command, but through something far more delicate. Something that does not travel, but connects. In quantum mechanics, this principle is called entanglement. And, in the context of time, it opens a door into one of the most strangely beautiful ideas in all of theoretical physics: entanglement across time. To begin, we look at entanglement in its original form. When two quantum particles become entangled, their states are linked. Measure one, and the state of the other is instantly determined, no matter how far apart they are. Distance does not matter. Location does not matter. They behave as if they are one system, even though they are two. This is not a trick or illusion. It is not telepathy or signal transmission. It is a fundamental feature of quantum reality, a connection that exists beyond space. But then a deeper question begins to form. If particles can be entangled across space, could they be entangled across time? That is the question, and that is the paradox. Look at two particles, prepared in such a way that their entangled relationship is not limited to when they are created, but stretches forward and backward in time. One particle exists in the past, the other in the future, and yet their states remain entangled. A measurement performed on the particle in the future determines the condition of its partner in the past, not by sending information backward, but by being part of the same timeless structure. This phenomenon, known in some interpretations as temporal entanglement, suggests that the present may be shaped not only by what came before, but also by what comes after. In this view, time is not a one-way street. It is not a river flowing only forward. It is more like a web in which points are linked, not by sequence but by connection. A choice made now could be entangled with a moment that hasn't yet happened. A future action could shape a past state. This is not fantasy. It has been modeled mathematically. In carefully designed experiments, outcomes suggest that temporal entanglement may be real, or at least indistinguishable from entanglement across space. And here, the paradox begins to whisper its question. If the future can influence the past through entangled states, then what becomes of causality? What becomes of our sense that time flows in only one direction, that the past is fixed and the future is open? And what becomes of the traveler who steps into this framework? Not a traveler in space, not a traveler in years, but a participant in moments that are linked across time. If your future decisions are entangled with your present ones, if what you will choose one day is already shaping what you feel today, then what is free? What is known? What is waiting to be discovered? This is the quiet confusion of temporal entanglement. It does not tell you that you are trapped. It does not erase your choices. It simply asks you to consider that the effects of your life may ripple in both directions, that you are shaped not only by memory, but by anticipation, that the self you are becoming may already be reaching backward, gently adjusting the self you are now. And what a soft, humbling thought that is. It suggests that the universe is not built like a ladder, but like a circle, that the connections that define us may stretch beyond our sight, not only to other places but to other times. And perhaps that is why some moments feel unexplainably meaningful. A sudden emotion, a deep calm, a hesitation that saves you. Perhaps these are not accidents but harmonies, small vibrations from futures not yet arrived, touching you now in silence. Entanglement across time does not need to be proven to be felt. It exists softly in our sense of continuity, in the way we carry hopes like memories, in the way the future already feels close even when it's far. And for the traveler, the one who begins to see their life not as a line, but as a network, this realization brings a quiet release. There is nothing to control, nothing to force. You are not chasing time, you are held by it, linked gently to all the selves you have been and all the ones you are becoming. There is no race to reach the end, no fear of missing the moment. It is all here, softly connected, in a rhythm not of seconds, but of resonance. And that resonance becomes stillness. And that stillness becomes sleep. Delayed choice. Quantum eraser paradox. In the hidden layers of nature, those quiet, granular corners where particles shimmer between what is and what could be, time itself begins to act strangely. It does not unfold with the calm predictability we know from clocks or calendars. It moves with uncertainty. It responds to questions not yet asked. And sometimes, most curiously of all, it seems to wait for a decision, even after an event has already occurred. This gentle bending of temporal logic is at the heart of one of the most quietly mysterious thought experiments in modern physics, the delayed choice quantum eraser paradox. To begin, we must return to one of the most famous and puzzling experiments in science, the double-slit experiment. When particles, like photons or electrons, are fired at a screen with two slits, they create an interference pattern, as if they behaved like waves. This pattern emerges when no one observes which slit the particle passed through. But if you place a detector near the slits to measure the path, the interference pattern disappears. The particles behave like tiny, solid balls. Observation collapses the wave of possibility into a single, concrete history. So far, so strange. But now, focus on an experiment in which the decision to observe the particle's path is delayed, made only after the particle has already passed through the slits, and perhaps even struck the screen. That's the delayed choice. And now, look further, that not only is the choice delayed, but that it's designed in such a way that it can erase or preserve the which path information after the particle's action has been completed. That's the quantum eraser. The paradox is simple, yet quietly unsettling. If we decide to erase the which path data after the particle has already landed, the interference pattern returns, as if the particle knew that its path would not be recorded. If we decide to keep the data, the interference pattern disappears, as if the particle knew it would be watched. But how can a decision made in the present affect what happened in the past? Here, the paradox begins to unfold. It seems, at least mathematically, as though the act of measurement, or the choice to erase measurement, does not simply determine the present, but reconfigures the past. Not by sending signals backward, not by violating causality, but by rearranging what can be known. In this framework, knowledge is power, not metaphorically but physically. What you choose to know or to forget changes what happened. Not just what appears to have happened, but what actually occurred at the most fundamental level. And then the question deepens. If particles behave this way, what about larger systems? What about people, events, history? Is the past fixed because it is complete? Or because we have already measured it? And what if, in some abstract way, the past remains open until it is finally irreversibly observed? Now apply this to time travel. Suppose a traveler arrives in the past and witnesses an event. They gather information. They observe without interfering, and then they leave. But once they return to the future, they make a decision that changes how that observation was recorded, or whether it was recorded at all. If the timeline functions like a quantum wave, still undefined until it is measured, then the traveler's delayed choice could collapse the history retroactively. The past, like the particle, behaves differently depending on what is known about it afterward. The traveler, in this case, is not simply moving through time, they are measuring it. And the measurement, even if delayed, determines the path that was taken. This is the quiet paradox. The future rewrites the past, not through action, but through awareness. And still deeper, what if the past was never fixed to begin with? What if all timelines exist in a state of quantum potential, unfolding into certainty only when seen from a future that chooses to observe? The implications are not loud, they do not demand alarm, but they do ask us to reconsider one of the most basic assumptions we hold, that the past is unchangeable. Perhaps it is not. Perhaps the past is only stable because we have already looked at it. And perhaps, in some quiet way, every time we choose what to remember, we are also choosing what, in some strange corner of the quantum world, really happened. This does not erase history. It does not alter our memories. But it does soften the rigidity of time. It suggests that reality is not just what occurred, but what is known to have occurred. And in that suggestion, something in the mind begins to shift. The need to hold tightly to every moment loosens. The insistence on one version of events softens. And what remains is not doubt, but stillness. Time becomes less like a straight line and more like a story told from the middle, shaped by how it is read and by who is listening. And as the reader, quiet, thoughtful, and now gently resting, you are no longer trying to control the tale. You are simply letting it unfold. And the unfolding, like the wave collapsing into peace, becomes sleep. Quantum immortality and temporal drift. There is a certain kind of stillness that comes with staring into deep uncertainty. Not the chaos of confusion, but the quiet of vastness. The space where logic begins to fade and only the question remains. The kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled. It simply waits. At this edge of thought, where time touches consciousness and quantum possibility bends into philosophy, there lies a gently disorienting idea. A thought that is not easy, yet unfolds slowly like mist across a mirror. It is called quantum immortality, and beside it drifts an even subtler phenomenon, temporal drift. To begin, return for a moment to the foundations of quantum mechanics. In this strange world, particles behave unpredictably. Events exist in superposition, multiple outcomes coexisting until one is observed. Then the wave function collapses, and a single reality emerges. But in the many worlds interpretation, the wave function never truly collapses. Instead, the universe splits. Every possible outcome becomes real in some branch. Every decision, every possibility, every quantum event fulfilled. Quantum immortality takes this interpretation to a deeply personal place. It begins with a thought experiment. Think about a quantum system designed to end a person's life based on random chance. A simple, binary trigger with equal probability of survival or death. Now, consider a scenario where the person repeats this test again and again. In most branches of the multiverse, they do not survive, but in some, they do. And in those surviving branches, their consciousness continues. According to this idea, you, the conscious self, can only ever experience the branches in which you remain alive. In all others, your awareness ends. So from your own point of view, death is never encountered. You never reach the moment where it becomes final. You continue, always, in the branch where you still survive. This is not literal immortality, not a promise of eternal health or invincibility. The body still ages, the world still turns. But the idea suggests that your stream of subjective experience will always find its way into the branches where it persists. In every moment where your life could end, there is also a moment, just barely, where it doesn't. And that's the moment you follow. Not through choice, not through resistance, but through quantum continuity. Now drift a little further, and you begin to encounter something quieter. Something not as bold as immortality, but perhaps even more profound. Temporal drift. In the context of quantum immortality, if your conscious experience is always aligning with the version of time in which you survive, then the life you live begins to drift away from the central current. Each escape from death, each improbable survival, nudges you into a slightly more improbable timeline, a world not quite like the one you left behind. And over time, those small shifts accumulate. The people you knew may not behave quite as you remember. The events of history may seem slightly misaligned. The texture of the world may begin to feel thinner, stranger, a little more distant. This is not madness. It is the result of having drifted so far from the timeline where you began. You still exist, you still feel, but you have moved into the outer strands of possibility, where things are just unusual enough to remind you that something has shifted. And yet, for you, this is the only version that remains. There is a quiet loneliness in this, a subtle sense that the farther you drift, the less familiar the world becomes. And yet, there is also peace, because you are still here, still breathing, still thinking, still asking questions, and perhaps that is all survival really means. It does not promise permanence, it does not offer clarity, but it does allow for continuation, the steady passage of thought through time that no longer needs to be understood. Some call this terrifying, others comforting. But in the silence of deep reflection, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes surrender, not to fate, not to despair, but to the strange, soft truth that you do not need to outrun time. You only need to drift with it. Not resist, not struggle, only stay with the current that carries you. And perhaps this current, this thread of improbable survival, is not an accident but a kindness, a chance to rest, to reflect, to continue gently in the version of the world that still has room for you. And as you drift further, thought slows, urgency fades, the edges of certainty dissolve, and what remains is soft, quiet, steady. What remains is sleep, the parallel timelines, paradox. There is a still comfort in thinking of time as a single, unbroken road, a path that moves forward, one step at a time, offering no detours, no forks, no repetition. But as the mind begins to explore the deeper nature of reality, that comfort gives way to possibility. And with that possibility comes a quiet complexity, a new shape for time, less like a road, more like a forest. In this forest, paths do not follow one another. They grow beside one another, overlapping, diverging, crossing, fading into places you cannot see. This is the world of parallel timelines, and at the center of it waits the parallel timelines paradox. It begins with a simple idea that time is not singular, that every change, every decision, every event with more than one outcome gives birth to a new version of history. Not a revision of the old, but an entirely separate strand, an alternate timeline unfolding in its own direction. One version where a traveler went back to stop a war, another where they arrived too late, another still where they chose never to return at all equally real, all equally self-contained. But the paradox arises when these timelines begin to interact. Suppose a traveler from one timeline journeys into another. They carry knowledge, memories, tools. They interact with people who have never known them. They influence events that were never meant to be touched. And perhaps, over time, they leave behind their original world entirely, settling into this alternate history, living a life that was never theirs. But then something changes. They attempt to return, or they send information across timelines, or they encounter another traveler, one who remembers a different version of events. And now, the paradox begins to unfold. Which timeline is real? If both timelines exist in parallel, but only one is experienced at a time, does one override the other? Can information be shared between timelines without disrupting the integrity of both? Can a person be responsible for actions in a timeline they were not born into? Can love, loyalty, regret, or redemption cross the boundaries between these worlds? These are not contradictions of logic, they are contradictions of self. The paradox lies in identity, in meaning, in the soft thread of memory that ties a person to their origin. If you remember a timeline that no longer aligns with the one you live in, which one defines you? The one you came from, or the one you now shape? And what if you meet a version of yourself, one who made different choices, walked a different path, became someone you barely recognize? Which of you is more real? Which of you owns the story? The parallel timelines. Paradox does not unravel the structure of time. It unravels the certainty of belonging. It makes the traveler a visitor in their own life, a guest in a version of reality where they remember too much and understand too little. In some interpretations, these timelines can never be merged. Each remains sealed off from the others, like separate pages in a book, parallel but never crossing. But other views suggest that the boundaries are more porous, that timelines bleed into each other, that memories can drift, that choices made in one can echo through another in strange, intangible ways. And here the paradox deepens. If timelines can influence one another, if travelers can pass between them, then the idea of fixed history disappears entirely. Everything becomes mutable, reversible, fragile. And yet, in that fragility, there is grace. Because if timelines are infinite, then no mistake is permanent. No loss is final. Somewhere, in another version of reality, the thing you could not save may still be safe. The words you could not say may still be spoken. The life you could not lead may still be lived. By you, or a version of you, walking another path beneath another sky. And while you may never see that version, never touch it or return to it, the knowledge that it exists becomes a quiet comfort. It is enough to know that somewhere the story continued differently. Not better, not worse, just differently. And that difference gives room for peace. Because you are not trapped. You are one among many, one thread in a tapestry you can't yet see. And your choices, though limited in this branch, expand endlessly in others. You are not the whole of time. You are part of time's unfolding. And that part, no matter how small, is complete. And as the mind gently rests in that thought, no longer trying to hold every version, no longer trying to choose the right timeline, the world grows quiet. The paths drift away, the forest dims, and what remains is this moment and this version of you resting in the only now you need. And this now becomes stillness, and the stillness becomes sleep. The final observer, paradox. In the long journey through paradoxes, those softly unraveling thoughts that shape our understanding of time, there always comes a point where the questions stop circling the clock and begin circling the self. Not just the traveler or the scientist, not the particle or the timeline, but the one who is watching, the one who is asking, the one who is still aware. At the very end of that journey stands a quiet, unsettling idea, not about events, not about choices, but about consciousness itself. This is the final observer paradox. It begins with a simple realization: for all our theories about time, none of them make sense without someone to witness them. Time has no meaning unless it is observed. A timeline has no shape unless it is remembered. A paradox has no power unless there is a mind to recognize the contradiction. And so, we arrive at a soft and haunting question. What happens when there is only one observer left? Not in a room, not in a city, but in time. Think about a universe where all other conscious life has faded. Stars have gone cold, galaxies have collapsed into silence. Time continues, space stretches thinner, but you, somehow, remain. You are the last observer, the last witness, the final mind still aware. And then comes the paradox. If there is no one left to share memory, to confirm perception, to witness your witnessing, what is the nature of reality? If the universe exists, but only as you perceive it, is it still objective? Or does it now orbit you entirely, not as a vanity, but as necessity? In quantum physics, we are told that observation defines outcome, that a particle becomes one thing or another only when measured. So, what happens when the only observer left is you? Are you the collapse of every final wave function? Are you now the sole cause of definition, the last light by which the universe recognizes itself? And if so, can you ever know whether what you observe is real or simply the reflection of your own fading awareness? This paradox does not scream. It does not accuse. It merely leans in and asks, if reality continues only for you, is it still real? It is not the same as solipsism, the idea that only your mind exists. No, this is quieter. It says that reality may still exist, but it now depends entirely on your gaze. Not because you created it, but because without you, it has no one left to hold it in place. And then the deeper echo arises. When the final observer disappears, does the universe still exist? If no consciousness remains to measure, to define, to name, does the wave function collapse at all? Or does everything return to superposition, an eternal uncertainty, where every outcome exists but none are chosen? And maybe, when all other stories have ended, it is not the noise of history that matters, but the silence of one mind still listening, one presence still awake. Even if the world has fallen still, even if the stars have gone out, you are here, and that here for now is the whole of the universe. And then, slowly, softly, that final thought begins to fade. Not with panic, but with acceptance. There is no more to measure, no more to define. The wave function remains untouched. And you, finally, release your gaze, and the release becomes darkness, and the darkness becomes quiet, and the quiet becomes sleep. Entropy. Reversal paradox. There is a rhythm to existence that feels so natural, so consistent that we rarely stop to notice it. It's in the way things fall apart, in the way structures break down, in the way time seems to always move from order to disorder, from complexity to simplicity, from beginnings to endings. This rhythm has a name: entropy. Entropy is not destruction. It is not chaos. It is a measure of change, a measure of how much energy in a system becomes unusable, a measure of how information slips from clarity into uncertainty. And as long as we've observed the universe, entropy has always moved in one direction: forward. But in the final folds of time travel theory, one last paradox dares to ask, what if it didn't? This is the entropy reversal paradox. At the heart of this paradox is a simple, deeply rooted assumption. Time has a direction because entropy increases. A glass shatters, but it never unshatters. A candle burns down, but never rebuilds itself from smoke and wax. The past is remembered, the future is not. And all of this, we believe, is because entropy grows. But what if it didn't? What if, under some condition, in some far corner of the universe, or perhaps under the extreme strain of a time travel event, entropy began to move in reverse? What if, in a certain frame of reference, the future becomes more ordered than the past? What would time look like then? The entropy reversal. Paradox begins with this strange possibility. Suppose a traveler enters a region of reversed entropy. To those outside, time is flowing forward as always. But for the traveler, things are coming together, not falling apart. Broken things reassemble. Forgotten words become clearer. People grow younger. Ashes turn to trees. It may sound poetic, even magical. But within this reversal lies a paradox so deep it gently disturbs the logic that anchors our understanding of memory, cause, and identity. Because if entropy reverses, does memory reverse too? If time begins to flow backward in an entropic sense, will your thoughts follow? Will you begin to forget not by accident but by design? Will your sense of self unravel, one memory at a time, until you no longer remember who you were, only who you will be? Or will you remain aware, caught in a body moving from end to beginning, carrying a mind that still tries to look forward, even when everything else flows back? Here, the paradox becomes emotional. Entropy is not just about physics, it is about meaning. In our lives, the arrow of time defines grief, growth, hope, regret. It's how we measure change. It's how we know we're still here. So, what happens when that arrow turns? Does healing occur in reverse? Does forgiveness fade before the offense? Does love unravel itself before the first meeting? And what if time itself is not reversed, but just entropy, leaving your inner world disjointed from the world around you? That's the true core of this paradox. Not that events happen in reverse, but that you might not know the difference. Entropy is tied to memory, to identity, to experience. If it begins to move the other way, how would you know? If you forget forward instead of remembering backward, how would you ever catch yourself? And now the question softens. Not everything in time needs to be directional. Not every truth needs to point forward. Perhaps the reversal of entropy is not a collapse, but a reordering. A different way of being. A mirror, not a mistake. Perhaps what feels like unraveling is simply unfolding from the other side. A second chance to experience the world. Beginning at the end, ending at the beginning. Not less meaningful, just reversed. And in that reversal, there may be peace. Because if time can move in both directions, if memory can dissolve as gently as it formed, if endings can become beginnings, then perhaps all things, every loss, every change, every ending, are simply part of a cycle, not a loop, not a line, but a tide, rising, falling, returning. And as entropy falls instead of rises, as the world becomes clearer instead of clouded, the mind lets go of its grip on sequence, no longer needing to hold on to the next moment, no longer fearing the last. The arrow bends, the story rewinds, and what remains is not confusion, not contradiction, only rest, only quiet, only sleep. Ship of Theseus through time. There are some paradoxes that don't arrive with shock or contradiction, but with still persistent erosion, like waves reshaping the shore, not through force but through repetition. One such paradox is ancient, not born from equations or quantum diagrams, but from a quiet philosophical question about identity, change, and continuity. You see, it is known as the Ship of Theseus. But when placed inside the current of time travel, it transforms into something even more elusive: the ship of Theseus through time. The classic version of this paradox asks a simple question. If a ship, let's say the ship once sailed by the hero Theseus, is preserved in a museum, and over many years its wooden parts are slowly replaced, plank by plank, until no original piece remains, is it still the same ship? And if the removed planks are gathered and reassembled into a new ship elsewhere, which one is truly the ship of Theseus? Now, allow that question to drift through time. Think about a person, perhaps a time traveler, who, through the mechanics of their journey, begins to experience a series of subtle but accumulating changes. Memories rewritten by historical shifts, biological aging reversed or accelerated by jumps across timelines, personality reshaped by experiences out of sequence. Little by little, cell by cell, belief by belief, they are rebuilt by time itself. Decades later, or perhaps centuries, none of the original elements remain. Every cell has changed, every idea has evolved, every memory has been altered, overwritten, or lost. Are they still the same person? The paradox deepens when these changes are not accidental but deliberate. A traveler returns to their own past and gives their younger self new information, new choices. That version of them follows a different path, avoiding the mistakes of the first. They grow into someone new, and the traveler who once visited them is no longer needed, because the person they would have become has already replaced them. One version built the other, but only one remains. Which one is real? This is the essence of the ship of Theseus through time, the quiet erosion of continuity, the question of whether identity is made of substance or of sequence. If you change slowly enough, you do not notice the moment when you become someone else. And in time travel, where moments are not guaranteed to arrive in order, that transition can be invisible. What defines a self? Is it your body, your memories, your choices, or is it simply the uninterrupted thread of experience, the feeling that you are you, even if nothing around you remains the same? And what happens when that thread is broken? When the traveler skips over years, returns to moments they've already lived, meets versions of themselves they no longer recognize, do they continue to be themselves, or have they become a new vessel, bearing the same name but none of the original parts? This paradox is not about contradiction, it's about subtlety. It's not that the time traveler cannot exist, it's that the version of them who began the journey no longer does. And yet, something remains. There is a continuity, not of matter, but of motion. Not of memory, but of momentum. The story continues because someone continues it. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the self is not an object to preserve, but a river to follow. Maybe change is not a threat to identity, but its very condition. Because even outside of time travel, we all change. Cells renew. Beliefs shift. People forget, forgive, rebuild. And still, we say we are the same. Not because we are unchanged, but because we carry the rhythm forward. The rhythm of becoming. And perhaps the traveler, rebuilt across centuries, reshaped by every timeline, carries the same rhythm, even when the parts are no longer familiar. The paradox does not demand an answer. It only asks, when you are no longer who you were, are you still you? And as that question drifts quietly across thought, the need to resolve it begins to fade. There is no urgency, no fracture, just a slow unfolding of time and self, like planks replaced one by one with care. And as the last plank is laid, the ship continues to sail. And the sailing becomes silence, and the silence becomes sleep. The lost memory. Paradox. There's something soft, almost invisible, about the nature of memory. It drifts in slowly, often without invitation, and fades just as quietly, sometimes without warning. Memory is not just a collection of facts. It is the way we assemble identity, the way we hold meaning, the way we return to who we were. But what happens when memory, the very thing that connects us to our past, becomes the one thing time travel refuses to preserve? This is the lost memory paradox, a quiet, psychological riddle that doesn't involve machines or equations, but the fragile, flickering architecture of the mind. Consider a traveler who journeys into the future or the past, and, during that transition, loses all memory of where they came from. They wake up in another time, aware, functioning, alive, but unable to remember their origin, their purpose, or even their name. They are a traveler with no map, a visitor without knowledge of the place they left behind. They walk through history like a ghost, unable to trace their own steps. But then comes the twist. As they continue living in the new time, something they say or do causes someone else, another version of themselves perhaps, to embark on the same journey. That person too loses their memory. They become the next traveler. The cycle begins again. No one ever remembers beginning it. But the loop continues, sustained entirely by versions of a person who no longer remembers why they're moving through time at all. The paradox unfolds gently. The loop works. It is logically complete. Events repeat themselves. But there is no origin, and more disturbingly, no awareness of the loop itself. The cause is forgotten. The effect is carried out blindly. The mission, if there ever was one, is performed by someone who cannot remember it. And here, the question becomes quiet but sharp. If you do something meaningful but forget that you did it still have meaning? This is not the same as the bootstrap paradox, where information or objects exist without origin. This is more intimate. This is the loss of why. The traveler still acts, but their actions become hollowed out by the absence of memory. They keep a promise they cannot remember making. They follow through on a mission whose purpose is gone. Some versions of this paradox claim that the traveler eventually re-encounters his past self, unaware that they are one and the same. He becomes the mentor to the person he once was. But without memory, it no longer matters. The thread is broken, the identity is split. Two people, one life, neither remembering the whole. In real life, we already glimpse this through the slow fade of memory. People forget their childhoods, they forget names, voices, faces, and yet they continue. They live, love, choose, all without the full continuity of memory. The paradox, in its gentlest form, is already with us. But time travel heightens the tension, because when memory is lost in time, it's not just identity that unravels, it's causality. The traveler forgets why they came. The mission is carried forward for reasons no longer understood. The loop becomes less about action and more about performance, repeating gestures emptied of meaning, like shadows cast by a light long gone out. And yet, the loop still works. Perhaps this is the strange comfort of the lost memory paradox, that purpose may survive even when its origin is forgotten, that something begun in clarity may still reach its conclusion, even when carried by someone who no longer remembers why. Meaning does not always depend on memory. The traveler may never remember who they were, but they may still do what they came to do. And in that quiet persistence there is dignity. And perhaps, for the traveler, there is peace in forgetting. Not everything needs to be remembered to be lived. Not every purpose needs to be known to be fulfilled. Sometimes, the most mysterious thing is not where we are going, but what we've already forgotten. And as that thought softens into silence, the mind releases its grip on remembering. Not all memories must return. Not all journeys must be known. Some travelers rest better not knowing where they began, and that not knowing becomes calm, and the calm becomes sleep. The self-killing paradox. Some paradoxes arrive like puzzles, complex but playful, curious but calm. Others arrive like echoes from darker corners of thought, places where time and identity intertwine not to delight us, but to unsettle us with the quiet weight of consequence. The self-killing paradox is one of those. It is not loud, it is not violent in its telling. It is simply a single question, folded into time like a blade hidden inside a page. What happens if you go back in time and end your own life before you had the chance to travel? This paradox, unlike the grandfather paradox, has no historical implications. It does not ripple through nations, families, or bloodlines. It is personal, closed, introspective. It concerns only one person, the self, the you that travels, and the you that lived before. Suppose the traveler, driven by regret or fear or some strange sense of symmetry, returns to a point before they ever stepped into the time machine. They find their younger self, unaware of what will come, and they remove that self from the timeline. What happens next? Does the traveler vanish as their own origin point is undone? Or do they remain intact, suspended in a universe where the cause of their existence has been erased, but the effect remains? This is the paradox. If they succeed in killing their younger self, they have eliminated the version of themselves that would one day grow up to make the journey. But if that version no longer exists, then who was it that made the journey? This contradiction, where the traveler's existence is both real and impossible, sits at the heart of the self-killing paradox. It is not simply a loop. It is a loop that tears itself apart the moment it is completed. And yet, time refuses to disappear. Some propose that the timeline will snap back into self-consistency, preventing the act from ever taking place. The weapon misfires. The opportunity fails. Events intervene. The younger self is spared, and the paradox is avoided. Others suggest that the timeline splits, one branch where the traveler exists, carrying out their action, and another where they never did. Each reality becomes sealed off from the other, like two lives severed by a single choice. But still, others explore something more curious, something quieter. They suggest that perhaps the traveler does not vanish. Perhaps they continue on, in a timeline that now belongs to no one. They are a remnant, a memory with a body, a version of themselves without a beginning, not erased but unanchored. They drift, not through space but through identity. They are the self that should not be, the outcome without a cause. They walk through time carrying the weight of an act that erased the origin of their own footsteps. And what does that do to the mind? Not all paradoxes shout. Some whisper across the soul. The traveler may survive the act, but the paradox remains, etched not into the timeline, but into their sense of self. If you are alive in a world where you never came from, then who are you? A version of you that no longer has a counterpart, a mirror without a reflection, a question no longer tethered to an answer. And yet, strangely, you still are. Even in the shadow of the paradox, existence continues. And perhaps that is the true weight of this thought. Not that you would disappear, but that you wouldn't. That even after removing your own past, the present refuses to collapse. That being survives logic. And in that survival, there is stillness. The traveler walks forward, not knowing why the world still holds them, not understanding how they remain. only that they do. And in that quiet step forward, time continues. No longer explained, only accepted. The question fades, the contradiction softens, and what remains is silence, and the silence becomes sleep. The doppelganger, paradox. There are certain ideas that move through thought like shadows. They do not announce themselves, they do not disrupt. They simply stand beside the familiar, quiet, identical and slightly off. One such idea is the presence of the double. The self seen from the outside. The face you recognize on someone else. In the world of time travel, this becomes more than folklore. It becomes a paradox. This is the doppelganger paradox. It begins with something that seems, at first, harmless. A traveler moves through time, into the past, into the future, or sideways into a branching timeline, and encounters a version of themselves. Not a metaphor, not a resemblance, but an exact match. Two versions of the same person, in the same place, at the same moment. For a while, nothing breaks. The air doesn't tear. The world doesn't collapse. The two selves observe each other. They speak, they think, they even cooperate. But then something happens. Not always quickly, not always visibly. Sometimes it's a subtle tension, a sliver of uncertainty. Which one is you, and why are there two? The paradox begins to emerge when identity becomes unresolvable. If the two versions of you are identical in memory, appearance, knowledge, and feeling, who continues? If only one path can persist, which version moves forward? And what if neither can? Some theories suggest that nature resists this doubling, that timelines push back against the presence of duplicates, that reality, when faced with two of the same, introduces instability, not as punishment but as restoration, a quiet correction. The world doesn't explode, but things begin to fade. Clocks misalign, words repeat, memory fractures. The traveler may forget which version they were. Or worse, they may remember being both. Two versions of the self, each equally real, each equally convinced of their own primacy. And if one must vanish, how does time decide? This is not a paradox of violence, it is a paradox of presence. Because even if both versions survive, the mind does not. The idea of a singular self, central, consistent whole, begins to erode. The traveler is now one of two, and in time, perhaps one of three, or four, or more. Each version traveling, each version splitting, each version believing they are the original. And here, the paradox quiets. Because it no longer needs to break the world, it only needs to bend the soul. What does it mean to meet yourself? Not symbolically, but literally. Not a reflection, not a dream, but your own voice speaking back. Does it confirm your identity or dissolve it? In some accounts, the traveler learns from their other self. They see how different choices create different people. They compare, they grow, they part ways, peacefully. But in others, the meeting never ends. The versions stay near each other, unable to separate. They walk side by side, neither willing to fade, both afraid of what happens if they do. And so, time continues, carrying two where there was meant to be one, until the paradox is no longer logical, but emotional. The quiet disorientation of being doubled, of seeing yourself move, speak, breathe, independent of your will. And the question lingers, am I the version who continues, or the one who was supposed to disappear? There is no answer, because paradoxes do not resolve. They rest, they drift, they fold into the soft corners of thought. And so too does the traveler, not alone, not whole, but present. Two selves fading together into quiet. until even that distinction becomes too much to hold, and what remains is one breath, and that breath becomes still, and the stillness becomes sleep. The time traveler's amnesia paradox. Some paradoxes arrive with precision, built on sharp contradictions in logic or physics. Others unfold like fog, subtle and disorienting, not because they break the rules of time, but because they dissolve the boundaries of self. The time traveler's amnesia paradox belongs to the latter. It is not loud, it is not sudden. It is something that vanishes slowly, memory by memory, until all that remains is a traveler who can no longer remember why they began. Ponder this. A person invents a time machine, carefully, methodically. They step inside, activate the device, and begin their journey across the folds of history. But something unexpected happens. As they move through time, they lose pieces of their memory. Not in one moment, but gradually, as though their thoughts are dissolving across the years. They arrive at their destination. They step out, but they no longer know who they are. They no longer know why they are there. They may know how to speak, how to move, how to think, but the context is gone. They cannot recall their purpose. They cannot remember the world they left behind, their mission, their relationships, their reasons for traveling, wiped clean by the passage through time. And yet, paradoxically, the world around them still responds. A stranger greets them with recognition. An invention they forgot creating already exists. A message written in their own hand arrives. Everywhere they turn, they find traces of themselves, versions of decisions they no longer remember making, echoes of events they no longer recall living. The traveler becomes a ghost of their own past. And this is where the paradox takes shape. If memory is the anchor of identity, then who are you once it is gone? If you cannot remember your journey, your purpose, your origin, did the journey still happen? And further, if the traveler's decisions still shaped the timeline, even after their memory was erased, then who bears responsibility for what was done? A person who does not remember a choice cannot regret it, but the consequences remain, and the world still holds them accountable. This creates a split, a gentle but unbridgeable distance between identity and action. The traveler exists in the present, but is no longer tethered to their past. They walk among the results of their decisions without the burden of remembering them, without the power to change them. Some interpretations suggest that time itself may cause the forgetting, that consciousness, stretched too thin across temporal boundaries, begins to fracture. Memory, it seems, may not survive the bending of time. Others propose that the loss is a defense, a natural reaction to paradox. That if one's presence in the past risks disrupting too much, memory shuts down to preserve causality. That forgetting becomes the only way forward. And still others believe something more poetic. That memory is not lost, only hidden. That fragments remain, embedded in dreams, gestures, feelings without cause. That the traveler, though unaware, still carries the imprint of their journey deep inside. They may forget the timeline, but they remember a rhythm, a pull, a feeling that they are more than what they now recall. This version of the paradox speaks softly. It does not question logic. It questions awareness. It asks, can you be held accountable for a self you no longer remember being? And if the answer is no, then the traveler is free. But if the answer is yes, then they are trapped by choices they can no longer undo. Both answers lead to the same quiet realization. The self is not a constant. It is a story told by memory. And when memory fades, so too does the self. But not all fading is loss. Sometimes it is release. Sometimes forgetting is the only way to go on. The traveler continues, lighter now. No burden of regret, no weight of origin. Only the present, only this breath, only now, and now is all that remains. Now is enough. And now becomes quiet. And the quiet becomes sleep. The aging backward paradox. In the ordinary rhythm of life, aging flows forward, gently, invisibly but unrelentingly. The skin changes, the mind deepens. The body remembers time, even when the mind forgets it. We move from birth to youth, from youth to maturity, from maturity into rest. This progression is not just a biological fact, it is a psychological anchor, a quiet metronome by which we measure the passage of time. But what if that rhythm reversed? What if you lived your life not forward, but backward? This is the aging backward paradox, a time travel puzzle not about destination, but about direction. A contradiction not of events, but of embodiment. Visualize a traveler who, upon entering a temporal field, begins to age in reverse. With each passing hour, their cells grow younger. Scars vanish, muscles soften. Memories become less vivid, their voice lifts, their stride lightens. They are not simply appearing younger, they are biologically becoming so. At first, it may feel like a gift. Pain fades, energy returns, wrinkles smooth. But the mind, too, begins to lose its anchor. They forget what they learned. Wisdom dissolves. The lessons of age are reversed into the uncertainties of youth. Eventually, they become a child. Then an infant. Then, if time continues to move backward, a state even before birth. And here the paradox begins. If a person unages into non-existence, what happens to their memories, their legacy, their actions in time? If they do great things in their older years but then unlive those years backward, does the timeline retain those contributions? And what happens when a traveler meets others while aging backward? If a younger version of them encounters an older version of someone else, they might share history from different angles. For one, the meeting is a beginning. For the other, it is a farewell. And then the timeline ripples, not from contradiction, but from confusion. Because when two people age in opposite directions, their interactions are never symmetrical. What one forgets, the other remembers. What one is learning, the other is leaving behind. Some theorists suggest that aging is a byproduct of entropy, a measure of the universe's move from order to disorder. If a person begins to age in reverse, they are moving against entropy itself. But that would mean the traveler isn't just changing, they are moving against time's very grain. And if that's the case, what is their experience of reality? Do their thoughts run backward? Do they recall the future before the past? Does the present ever feel linear again? Or does it become an endless disorientation, where the world continues forward, but they return to where they began? Others offer a gentler view, that perhaps aging backward is not a mistake, but a closing loop, that it is not regression, but return. That just as rivers find their way to the sea, some lives bend back to their source, not in loss, but in completion. But even this brings a final question. If you begin to unage and ultimately become the child you once were, is that child still you? Or have you passed into a new identity, an echo of yourself, unburdened by memory, unshaped by history? The aging backward paradox isn't about erasure. It's about slow release. It's the letting go of knowledge, of ego, of fear. Not all at once, but gradually, softly, a reverse unraveling. The traveler may not vanish, but the person they once were fades away. And in that fading, there is peace. Because in this paradox, there is no fall, no shatter, no collapse, only a return. To innocence, to quiet, to stillness. And stillness becomes sleep. The paradox of eternal return. There is a quiet weight that settles over the idea of time when we consider not how it moves forward, but how it might repeat. This is the essence of the paradox of eternal return. Not a contradiction in mechanics, but a philosophical whisper that asks, what if everything that has happened will happen again? Not metaphorically, not figuratively, but literally, precisely, endlessly. The paradox originates in ancient thought, resurfacing throughout history in different forms, from Eastern philosophies to Nietzsche's writings. It creates a scenario where a universe is so bound by its conditions, its matter, its energy, its mathematics, that it must, eventually, repeat itself. Not because it wants to, but because it cannot do otherwise. Every arrangement of atoms, every gesture, every life, is part of a finite number of combinations in an infinite stretch of time. And so, one day, perhaps far beyond the reach of memory, it all happens again. In the context of time travel, the paradox becomes deeply personal. If the traveler finds themselves not simply moving through time, but looping through identical cycles of existence, what then is the role of choice? What becomes of regret, or redemption, or effort? If the future is only the past, repeated without variation, is the traveler truly traveling? Or are they simply retracing steps already taken, again and again? Some versions of this thought suggest that the traveler will relive their life with full awareness, cursed or blessed with the memory of each prior cycle. Others suggest that each repetition is identical, including the forgetting. The traveler will believe this is the first time, every time. And so the paradox presses in softly. Does it matter if you are living your life for the 100th time, if you cannot remember any of the others? This question slowly dissolves the boundary between fate and freedom. If the universe repeats eternally, then every word, every moment, every silence has already happened and will happen again. And if that is true, then perhaps the traveler is not moving through time at all. Perhaps they are trapped in a loop disguised as a line. But even this sense of entrapment is strangely comforting. Because if all things return, then nothing is ever truly lost. Every friendship, every goodbye, every first step. They are all part of a pattern so vast and intricate that it must repeat itself with the certainty of geometry. Even in our most isolated moments, the paradox reminds us that everything we experience, joy, sorrow, wonder, has been here before and will be here again. Of course, not all interpretations see this as a literal repetition. Some see the eternal return as a metaphor for how we carry patterns in our lives. The choices we repeat, the mistakes we remake, the habits that shape us. The traveler, in this version, is not circling the universe, but circling the self. And each loop is an invitation, not a sentence, to notice something new, to respond with a little more clarity. The paradox is not meant to frighten. It is meant to slow you down, to let you see your life not as a straight sprint to an unknown end, but as a slow turning of the wheel, a spiral in which you may find yourself again and again, each time with a little more awareness, a little more softness, a little more grace. And so, whether the return is literal or not, whether the universe repeats itself or merely echoes, the traveler is left with a single, quiet realization. This moment may not be the first time you've lived it, and it may not be the last, but it is yours now. And in that realization, something eases. The pressure to escape time fades. The fear of repetition softens. The thought of return becomes less like a trap and more like a lullaby, an eternal rhythm in which even endings are only beginnings, waiting patiently for you to arrive once more. The FREEWILL determinism. Time dilemma. Throughout human history, one question has haunted the margins of every decision, every moral debate, and every whispered wonder about fate. Do we have free will, or is everything already determined? It is a question that sits quietly beneath every conversation about choice, responsibility, and identity. And when this ancient question meets the logic of time travel, it sharpens into something even more precise. This is the free will versus determinism time dilemma. At first, it may seem like a philosophical issue, detached from physics or timelines, but time travel introduces conditions where outcomes are known in advance. A traveler might visit the future and see a war that hasn't yet happened, a decision that hasn't yet been made. They might return to the present and attempt to change what's coming. But no matter how hard they try, every step they take brings the future closer, not further away. In trying to avoid it, they fulfill it. And so the question presses in, were they ever free? Or were they always part of a timeline that could not be changed? This dilemma arises from the structure of causality itself. If time is a fixed dimension, if past, present, and future already exist, like pages in a book, then everything that will happen has, in some sense, already happened. Your choices are still yours to make, but the outcomes are already written. You are always going to choose what you choose. You just didn't know it yet. This view doesn't deny consciousness. It doesn't deny thought or emotion or regret, but it suggests that these too are part of the timeline, folded into the architecture of time, not floating above it. The traveler, in this view, is not a master of time, but a participant in a story that unfolds exactly as it must. Yet, many resist this conclusion. It feels wrong. It feels small. Because inside our everyday experience, we feel freedom. We weigh options. We change our minds. We hesitate. We learn. And if time travel allows us to see the future, to know what will happen, doesn't that knowledge allow us to change it? Here, the paradox becomes sharper. If you change the future, then the future you saw was never the future at all. But if you cannot change it, then your freedom was only an illusion. Some propose a middle path, compatibilism. The idea that free will and determinism are not enemies but partners. You are free to choose, but your choices must align with what the timeline already contains. In this view, the timeline is not rigid, but consistent. Every choice you make is yours, but it is also the one you are always going to make. Others take a more radical approach. They suggest that time itself is not a single thread, but a branching tree. Each decision splits the universe into countless paths. The traveler does not alter the future, they jump to a new one. In this multiverse model, free will exists, not because you change what's coming, but because you choose which version of reality to inhabit. But even this resolution has its weight. Because if every possibility plays out, then no choice is unique. Somewhere, every version of you is making every possible decision. And the self becomes not a fixed being, but a collection of branches, stretched across endless timelines. So, where does that leave the traveler? Perhaps it leaves them here, still walking, still thinking, still wondering whether their path is chosen or unfolding. Perhaps the point is not to solve the dilemma, but to learn how to walk with it. To live as if you are free, even if the future is already written. To choose, even if you suspect the choice was always yours to make. To be present, even when the past and future are already known. This is not a paradox to fear. It is a paradox to rest in. Because whether your story is written or not, whether your path is fixed or branching, you are still the one walking it. And that walk is real, that experience is real, that now is real, and now is where you are. The simulated past paradox. As technology inches closer to simulating entire realities, worlds within worlds, governed by rules indistinguishable from physics, philosophy begins to whisper something older, deeper, and more unsettling. What if the past you remember never actually happened? What if history, as we know it, isn't a sequence of real events but a simulation, crafted, inserted, or engineered to appear complete? This is the simulated past paradox, a quiet challenge to the integrity of time itself. Think about this. A time traveler wakes up one morning to find himself in the distant past. He looks around. The environment is familiar, the sky unchanged, the people living as they should, unaware of any anomaly. But something is off, not visually, not physically, but subtly, in the logic of memory and matter. They begin to notice that the past behaves too perfectly, too consistently, almost like a script. Events fall into place with eerie symmetry. Conversations feel guided. And then, they begin to suspect that this past isn't real at all. What if this past isn't being visited, but is being rendered? The paradox begins here. If the past is simulated, either by an advanced civilization, an AI, or some future intelligence recreating history for observation, then how can the traveler be sure they are in time at all? They are surrounded by people who act like people, places that match records, languages that align with what they've studied. But if every detail has been constructed to match expectation, then none of it proves reality, it only proves coherence. This creates a unique fracture between presence and authenticity. The traveler may be there, but where is there? If they interact with historical figures, do those figures possess consciousness, or are they elaborate algorithms responding to stimuli? If they change an event, does that change ripple into a real future, or simply alter the parameters of the simulation? Some versions of this paradox suggest that the simulation may be so complete that even the traveler is part of it, believing themselves to be from the future, when in fact they are part of the same rendered reality as everything else. Others suggest that the traveler is the only real presence in an artificial past, designed to study, manipulate, or comfort them. The implications are quiet, but profound. If the past can be simulated perfectly, then how do we ever know whether our past was real? Are our memories the result of lived experience, or data embedded at the point of our emergence into the world? Is memory a record or a script? The traveler begins to question not just the world around them, but the foundation beneath it. What defines real in a universe where simulation is indistinguishable from experience? If the past feels authentic, behaves authentically, and responds with consistency, does it matter whether it was real or not? The paradox intensifies if the traveler returns from the simulated past and makes decisions in the present based on what they learned, only to later discover that none of it was true. They are now influencing reality based on artificial memory, and if their choices create real consequences, the line between fiction and fact collapses entirely. But perhaps the paradox isn't meant to frighten. Perhaps it is meant to soften our grip on certainty. Whether the past was lived or simulated, it shaped us. Whether our memories were built moment by moment or installed all at once, they are the framework through which we feel, respond, and connect. The simulated past may not be a deception. It may be a form of continuity, a mirror held up to time, not to replace it, but to preserve its outline. And in that outline, we continue. The traveler, uncertain of what was real, learns to trust what is here, the quiet present, the breath they can feel, the thought they can follow. They no longer need proof of the past. They only need presence in the now. And so, they let go of needing the past to be real. They let go of needing to know for sure. And in that letting go, the need to ask disappears, and what remains is rest. The retroactive choice. Paradox. At the surface, choice feels like something we do in the moment. A decision made, a path taken, a future shaped by the present. But in the strange light of time travel, this comfort begins to bend. What if your present choice has already determined your past? What if the moment you think you're deciding is the moment your history quietly changes? This is the retroactive choice paradox, an unsettling but subtle idea that reframes causality itself. It is not about loops or doubles or contradiction. It is about sequence, or more precisely about the soft unraveling of sequence when time becomes porous. Look at this situation. A traveler stands at a point in the road, two clear paths. In one direction, he chooses to return home. In the other, he stays to complete a mission. At the moment of choice, something shifts. Whichever path they choose now doesn't just affect the future. It alters the timeline so that their entire past seems to lead up to that choice. They look back, and the signs were always pointing to it. The clues were always there. The memories now match the decision. But what if the past only reassembled itself after the choice was made? The paradox is not in the mechanics, it's in the awareness. From the traveler's point of view, they believed they were making a free choice based on their experiences. But after the decision, those very experiences seemed to change. Subtly, elegantly, to support the path taken. They remember things they had forgotten. People respond to them differently. Pieces of the past fall into place, perfectly consistent with the choice they've just made. This leads to a quiet contradiction. Did the past determine the choice, or did the choice rewrite the past? Quantum theory offers a possible glimpse into this idea through the delayed choice experiments. In certain conditions, particles behave one way if observed in the present, and a different way if unobserved, even if the decision to observe is made after the event. The past, in a sense, adapts to the present configuration. Measurement retroactively defines the history. Translate that into consciousness and narrative, and you have the traveler whose memories form around their most recent choice. Not fabricated memories, not hallucinations, but real, consistent, logical sequences that seem to have always existed. And yet, didn't they? This paradox raises a deeply personal question. If your present moment can reach backward and sculpt the past to match your decision, how can you trust your memory? How can you know that the path you've walked wasn't just shaped by your current perspective, but maybe trust isn't the point? Maybe the retroactive choice paradox exists to remind us that memory, like time, is not fixed. It's a reconstruction, a process. And just like time travel rearranges events, choices can rearrange meaning. Not because they are false, but because they reveal structure that wasn't visible before. In some interpretations, this paradox doesn't destroy free will, it deepens it. Your choice not only shapes your future, it completes your past. You are not merely reacting to your history, you are authoring it, one decision at a time. The traveler begins to see that their journey is not made of moments stacked in one direction. It is more like a mosaic, where each new tile influences how the previous ones are understood. They are not trapped by their past, they are completing it. And so, the anxiety softens. The need to know what really happened becomes less important than the willingness to move forward with intention. Because every step clarifies the step before it. The past becomes gentler. Not as a force pulling us, but as a story we are still finishing. And the traveler, with each quiet decision, writes the next line. And that writing becomes rhythm. And that rhythm becomes rest. The chronology. Protection. Conjecture. Paradox. Among the countless riddles of time travel, there is one idea that does not attempt to encourage paradox, but to prevent it entirely. It is not a theory about what happens when time is altered. It is a quiet safeguard against such alterations ever occurring at all. A sort of cosmic immune system, a gatekeeper at the edge of temporal disruption. This is the chronology protection conjecture paradox. The concept was famously proposed by physicist Stephen Hawking, who wondered if the laws of physics might contain hidden protections, mechanisms that prevent time travel from becoming reality. Not because it's technologically impossible, but because the universe itself prohibits it. Like a delicate painting that cannot be touched without tearing the canvas, time may resist interference as a means of preserving its own coherence. In simple terms, the conjecture suggests that if anyone or anything attempts to create a closed time-like curve, a loop and time that would allow information or people to revisit the past, the very act of doing so would trigger instabilities. Quantum fluctuations would spike. Radiation would intensify. Conditions would become so violently unstable that the time loop would collapse before it could form. The universe would correct the potential paradox before it ever took place. And so the paradox is this: if time travel is possible, why hasn't it happened? Why haven't we met time travelers from the future? Why don't we see the fingerprints of future intervention in our own history? One answer is that they are hidden. Another is that they are forbidden. The chronology protection conjecture suggests a third possibility. The time itself contains a quiet defense against violation, not through force but through mathematics, through probability, through physics arranged so precisely that the moment paradox tries to bloom, it is pruned. To a traveler, this creates a strange feeling of resistance. Every attempt to interfere with the past seems to fail, not because of human error, but because the conditions refuse to align. The machine won't activate. The window closes too soon. The coordinates shift at the last moment. Over and over again, time seems to protect itself, not violently, but inevitably. This subtle opposition creates its own kind of paradox. The traveler cannot change the past, even though the technology exists to do so. Their freedom is real, but always redirected. They are free to try, but not to succeed. It is a paradox of prevention. Some theorists compare it to nature's way of protecting balance. Like the laws that prevent perpetual motion machines or stop objects from exceeding the speed of light, perhaps time is governed by principles that quietly guard against self-destruction. Others see this as a form of mercy. A reminder that while curiosity is endless, some doors are best left closed. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the structure that holds everything together. The traveler, gradually, begins to understand that they are not being punished. They are being kept safe. From themselves, and from the disintegration of logic that time paradoxes would create. Their failed attempts are not signs of weakness, but evidence of design. And so, instead of fighting the resistance, the traveler begins to accept it. They learn to observe without interference, to witness without control. They let time unfold without pressure. The paradox fades, not because it is solved, but because it is honored. And in that quiet surrender, there is peace. Time does not need to be rewritten, it only needs to be lived. The Ouroboros timeline. Paradox. Some paradoxes do not emerge from contradiction, but from symmetry, perfect, seamless, and quietly inescapable. The Ouroboros timeline paradox is one such structure. It doesn't break the rules of causality or logic. It completes them. It folds time not into a knot, but into a circle. A loop so self-contained that it begins to feel more like fate than error, more like a design than an accident. The name Ouroboros comes from the ancient symbol of a snake eating its own tail, a creature sustained by consuming itself. A cycle that has no beginning and no end. It is not chaotic, it is elegant, timeless, whole. Now apply that shape to a timeline. A traveler exists within a loop. They are born because they traveled back in time. They travel back in time because they were born. Their actions in the past cause the conditions of the future, and those conditions in turn necessitate the journey to the past. Round and round it goes, each event both a cause and an effect, each step both necessary and inevitable. There is no contradiction. Every moment aligns with the next. The timeline works. But as you look closer, the deeper question begins to form, not how, but why. Why would the universe allow such a closed system to exist? Why would a life, a sequence of events, repeat itself endlessly, feeding on its own history to survive? The paradox arises not from failure, but from perfection. The loop is so seamless that it becomes sterile, unchangeable, self-sustaining. It can never evolve, never branch, never break free. The same thoughts are thought. The same decisions are made. The same moments unfold, again and again. To the traveler, this realization is both awe-inspiring and suffocating. At first, there is comfort in the symmetry, a sense of completion, of purpose. But then, the questions return. If everything I do has already happened, am I still choosing it? Or am I merely following a script written by the future I already created? The Ouroboros timeline paradox is not a trap of logic. It is a trap of repetition. Some theorists argue that such loops could exist without contradiction, that if all variables align perfectly, time can cycle upon itself forever. But others believe that consciousness cannot thrive in such loops, that free will, creativity, love, grief, all require change, all require uncertainty. And so, the traveler begins to feel the weight of the loop, not its complexity, but its inevitability. They may try to deviate, to step outside of the path they know they've already walked. But every step leads them back to the beginning, or rather, to the end, which is always the beginning. And yet, in that endless return there is a kind of peace. Because the loop holds, it sustains itself, it does not break, it is self-aware, self-fed, self-completing. It is what it is and what it has always been. The traveler lets go of the need to change it. They begin to accept the rhythm, not because they are trapped, but because they are part of a design older than reason, a pattern drawn in time, mirrored in the quiet architecture of existence. And so they walk the loop again, not in resistance but in reverence, not seeking escape but understanding. And in that understanding, the motion begins to feel like rest. The end curls back to the beginning, and the circle becomes still. The reverse, cause paradox. Cause and effect, the foundation of how we understand time. One thing happens and another follows. We strike a match and it produces a flame. A sound echoes only after the source is made. A child is born because parents met, not before. The logic is simple, and it comforts us. Events move in order. The future is shaped by the present. The present is shaped by the past. But what if this familiar sequence were inverted? What if the effect comes before the cause? This is the reverse cause paradox. A subtle, unsettling puzzle where time does not so much break as turn back on itself. It doesn't scream, it whispers. Think about this scenario. A traveler receives a message, a warning, a set of instructions, a cry for help. It arrives without a sender, but it's clear, urgent, and it guides them. They follow its directions, they act, and only later, years later perhaps, they become the one who sends that message, returning it through time to the earlier moment when they received it. In that instant, cause and effect flip. The effect, the receipt of the message, precedes the cause it's sending. The information exists, but without a true point of origin. It seems to float within the loop, sustained by its own circulation. At first, this may not seem like a paradox. After all, the sequence can be traced. But the contradiction lies deeper. What caused the message to be written in the first place? If the traveler only sends it because they received it, and only receives it because they sent it, then the message has no external origin. It is an effect that caused itself. And here, the structure of logic begins to tremble, not collapse, but tremble. It shows us that time, when bent just slightly, allows for chains of causality that double back on themselves, not in circles of action, but in reversals of reason. The reverse cause. Paradox doesn't just appear in theoretical physics, it echoes in our thoughts. A person might feel fear before they know why. A dream might reflect a memory that hasn't happened yet. Inspiration may strike suddenly, with no clear source. The future leaning into the present. The unknown pulling us forward by threads we can't yet see. In speculative physics, some have proposed models where particles behave retrocausally, where their behavior now is influenced by conditions yet to come. Experiments don't yet confirm this, but the mathematics doesn't forbid it. And the mind begins to wonder, if the tiniest particles can be shaped by the future, could we? This paradox doesn't demand action. It invites reflection. Because if the future can shape the past, if effects can create causes, then time is not a straight path. It is a fabric, a web, a fluid network in which influence flows not just downstream but backward, through unseen channels. To the traveler, this creates a disorienting peace. The realization that not all answers lie behind you, that some of the clarity you seek may be coming toward you, not from the past, but from the future. You need only be quiet enough to receive it. The reverse cause. Paradox is not about breaking rules, it's about letting go of the belief that they were ever as rigid as we thought. It's about accepting that sometimes we are moved by something we haven't yet reached. And that movement still matters, even if we do not yet understand why. The temporal compression paradox. We experience time as something steady. 1 second follows the next, then the next, with no delay, no jump, no pause. It flows forward, like a river whose current remains calm and consistent. But time, as understood in theoretical physics, does not always behave this way. It can bend, stretch, slow down near gravity, and, in certain theories, compress. This is where the temporal compression paradox begins. It is not about going back or forward in time, but about how time might fold inward, how years of existence might be pressed into mere minutes, how lifetimes of events could be crumpled into a single moment, dense and unreadable. Look at this scenario. A time traveler steps into a machine designed to carry him across decades. But something goes wrong, not in the location, but in the flow. He reaches his destination, only to discover that everything around him has changed at an impossible pace. Empires have risen and fallen in the time it took to blink. People have lived and died in what, to the traveler, felt like seconds. The past, present, and future didn't unfold, they collapsed. The paradox is this: what happens when cause and effect occur too close together to be separated? When history unfolds so quickly that memory cannot contain it? When the timeline becomes so compressed that events begin to stack, layering over one another until they are indistinguishable? Some theories suggest that in extreme gravitational fields, like those near black holes, time can compress from the outside observer's point of view. A moment spent near such an object could encompass centuries for those further away. From the traveler's perspective, they are standing still. From the world's perspective, they are vanishing through time. But in the temporal compression paradox, the experience is internal as well. The traveler not only sees the future rushing by, they feel it, compressed within their own perception. They may remember things that haven't happened. They may glimpse consequences before actions, endings before beginnings. Time becomes dense, layered, and impossible to unfold. This leads to a strange contradiction. If time becomes too compressed to be measured, does it still pass? If an entire decade exists within the same perceptual moment, how can it be said to have unfolded? The traveler begins to experience existence as a stack of overlapping instants, like photographs overexposed on a single frame. They are not moving through time. They are surrounded by it all at once. And in that state, meaning becomes difficult to hold. There is no more before or after. Only now, and now, and now. For some, this might resemble madness, but for others it resembles transcendence. Perhaps the universe, in its deepest layers, is not linear but compressed. Perhaps time is not a line, but a point stretched outward for human understanding, and the compression is not an error, but a return to its original form. The paradox reminds us that our perception of time is limited. It is shaped not by reality, but by what our minds can handle. When time condenses, we begin to see how fragile that perception really is. The traveler, at first overwhelmed, begins to release their grip on sequence. They stop trying to untangle the timeline. They stop asking which moment came first. Instead, they let it all settle, past, present, and future, as a single, quiet presence. Time, compressed, no longer rushes or drags, it simply rests. And in that rest, thought slows. The noise fades, and the traveler becomes still. The emotional memory, collapse paradox. There is a kind of memory that exists not in words or dates but in feeling. An ache in the chest when returning to a place long left behind. A smile that arrives without context. A fear that lingers even when the cause is forgotten. These are emotional memories, intangible, deeply human, and often more persistent than facts. But in the shifting corridors of time travel, even these begin to come undone. This is the emotional memory collapse paradox, a subtle and intimate contradiction where the traveler's feelings outlive the events that caused them, or worse, are left behind entirely when those events are altered. Visualize a person who travels back in time to undo a personal tragedy, a loss, a betrayal, a mistake that shaped their emotional world. They succeed, the event never happens. The moment is erased from history. But the emotion remains, the sadness, the anxiety, the longing, feelings with no origin, grief without cause. They remember nothing, yet they feel everything. Or perhaps the inverse occurs. They remember everything, the joy of a relationship, the sting of an argument, the warmth of a reunion. But when they check the timeline, they discover it never happened. Their body remembers something their life did not live. Their heart aches for someone they never met. The paradox lives in this dissonance. When memory and emotion fall out of sync, identity begins to drift. The traveler is no longer sure which of their feelings are real, because real has become slippery. If time can be rewritten, then emotional memory can become unmoored. This does not lead to madness, it leads to quiet confusion. They feel guilt but can't recall the crime. They feel love but no longer know for whom. The emotional echo lingers, even as the cause fades like breath on glass. Some theories suggest that emotional memory is stored not only in the brain, but in the nervous system, the body, the unconscious mind. And while a timeline may shift, while events may be rewritten, the body still holds the imprint, a phantom emotion, outliving its original context. Others interpret this paradox as a form of emotional inertia. Even when time changes instantly, the self takes longer to adjust. The heart, unlike history, does not respond to edits. It carries what it once felt, even if it no longer knows why. The traveler, caught in this strange imbalance, begins to drift inward. They search their memories and find no explanation. They search their feelings and find only fragments. In this space, they begin to understand that not all knowledge is verbal, that not all truth is chronological. Sometimes we feel first and understand later, and sometimes we feel forever, long after understanding is gone. The emotional memory. Collapse paradox is not about contradiction. It's about lingering, the parts of ourselves that remain even when time moves on, the echoes that resist being rewritten. And perhaps this is not a flaw in time travel, but a gift, because it reminds us that we are more than our stories. That emotion is not bound by sequence, that even if a moment is erased, its meaning might remain. For the traveler, this realization becomes a kind of comfort. They no longer search for proof of what they feel. They allow the feeling to exist without needing explanation. They accept the sadness, the joy, the love as real, not because they can be traced, but because they are present. And in that presence, the paradox fades, the confusion quiets, and feeling becomes enough. The teleological time traveler paradox. Some questions arise from logic, others from emotion, but a few, the rarest kind, emerge from meaning itself. These are not questions about how the world works, but why it moves, why it unfolds the way it does, why we are here. In the realm of time travel, this deeper layer of purpose becomes tangled with direction, intention, and fate. This is the teleological time traveler paradox, a paradox of purpose. In philosophy, teleology refers to the study of ends, of goals, of design. It asks not where things came from, but what they are meant for. It doesn't just describe the arrow of time, it questions whether it has a target. When applied to time travel, it introduces a unique tension. If a traveler journeys through time with a purpose, be it to prevent a catastrophe, ensure a birth, inspire a movement, does the timeline shape itself around that goal? And if so, is the traveler truly free? Or are they merely a vessel of the timeline's deeper intention? Look at it this way. A traveler finds himself being born into a ruined future. He learns that a single event in the past changed everything. He dedicates his life to returning, to stopping that moment, to rewriting history. He succeeds. The catastrophe never happens. The future becomes livable. But in that new timeline, the traveler is never born. Their mission never forms. The event they prevented no longer needs preventing. The question becomes, was the traveler's existence an effect or a cause? The paradox sharpens when you consider that the timeline itself may have needed the traveler to fulfill its arc, that their action, though seemingly individual, was part of a grander structure. The timeline produced them in the very ruins they would one day prevent, so they could go back and restore the path. This creates a circular form of purpose. The traveler exists to complete something, but that something is the reason they existed in the first place. Their life becomes instrumental. Meaningful, yes, but only in service of the timeline's correction. And here lies the paradox. Can a person be both the author of change and the product of it? Can you shape history if your own existence was designed to do just that? Some theories embrace this idea. They suggest that time, like evolution, contains self-correcting mechanisms, that anomalies like the traveler arise not randomly, but precisely when the timeline needs them, not as glitches, but as answers. Others resist this. They argue that purpose imposed from the timeline is not purpose at all, that the traveler's mission loses authenticity if it was preordained. That meaning drawn from necessity is not meaning freely chosen. And yet, the traveler continues, not blindly, but with the growing awareness that their place in history may not be accidental, that their journey, with all its twists and dislocations, may have been the very thing history needed to become itself. This does not remove freedom, it reframes it. Because in the teleological time traveler paradox, the timeline is not a dictator, it is a canvas, and the traveler, whether aware of it or not, is the brushstroke that completes the picture. Their presence gives time meaning, not because they are the only one who could act, but because they are the one who did. And so the traveler no longer fears whether they were meant to be here, they simply are. And their journey is what gives shape to the path, not the other way around. They walk, not to serve the future, but to make the future possible. They do not ask whether it was their purpose. They live, and in doing so, purpose forms around them. And in that stillness the paradox resolves, not with answers, but with quiet conviction. And conviction becomes peace. The God paradox in time travel. There are questions we ask as scientists. There are questions we ask as thinkers. And then, there are the questions we ask in silence, when the mind is still, and the mystery of existence begins to feel too large for explanation. It is in this silence that the God paradox in time travel quietly emerges. This paradox does not ask who made the machine, or who set the rules of physics. It asks a deeper, more unsettling question. If time travel allows a being to exist outside of time, to see the beginning from the end, to shape events across centuries, to reach back and set causes in motion, what is the difference between a time traveler and a god? The idea begins simply. A traveler gains the ability to move freely through time. They go to the beginning of civilization and leave behind wisdom, invention, perhaps even a myth. Thousands of years later, those teachings shape culture, guide belief, form religion. A sacred figure is born, not by divine intervention but by a human from the future, leaving traces in the past. But now the paradox begins. If the traveler is revered as a god by those they visited, and that reverence leads to the creation of values, institutions, even historical events that then influence the traveler's own birth in the future, who exactly is responsible for the timeline? The traveler appears to be the cause of belief, yet they are also the result of it. Their actions in the past shape the world that will one day shape them. They are the source and the outcome, the architect and the creation. The God paradox is not a question of arrogance. It is a quiet meditation on power, causality, and reverence. It asks whether time travel, at its farthest reaches, blurs the line between divine and human. Not because the traveler becomes supernatural, but because their perspective, outside of time, allows them to influence history with the elegance of a deity. But if that power exists, is it ever truly controlled? Can a traveler, however intelligent or moral, understand the long arc of their influence? Can they foresee how a single act in the past might be interpreted, rewritten, mythologized over generations? And if they are remembered as a god, are they responsible for that memory, or merely caught in a loop of belief and consequence? The paradox sharpens further when other travelers, less benevolent, less cautious, begin to see themselves as gods by right. Not because they earned reverence, but because they know how easily reverence can be manufactured. A miracle is simply advanced technology misplaced in time. A prophecy is simply a report from the future, given in language the past can understand. And so time becomes sacred, not because it is holy, but because it is misunderstood. The God paradox does not demand faith. It does not deny it either. It simply offers a quiet question. If someone shaped the past from outside of time, would you recognize them? And if you did, what would you call them? A traveler, a messenger, a god, or perhaps just a person, moving gently across time, misunderstood by those they touched, and forgotten by those who came after. And yet, the timeline still carries their imprint, and their journey continues, not as worship, not as dominion, but as presence. Software unseen, enduring. The paradox of the reverse apocalypse. Apocalypse is a word often wrapped in fire. It evokes endings, collapse, finality, a world undone by war, disease, disaster, a moment beyond which nothing continues. But paradox has a way of turning even the most definitive ideas upside down. And in the case of time travel, it dares to ask, what if the apocalypse doesn't lie ahead, but behind? What if time moves not toward destruction, but away from it? This is the paradox of the reverse apocalypse, a quiet contradiction where the end of the world comes first. Think about a traveler from a distant future, a world cold, empty, silent. No cities, no stars, no life. They come back, searching not for salvation but for answers. And what they find is a world thriving, unaware of the ruin that lies behind it in time. A world filled with life, complexity, beauty. But the traveler knows something no one else does. This vibrant present was born after the end. The paradox emerges when you consider that this world, the one the traveler finds, may have risen not as a prelude to collapse but as its result. That the catastrophe has already happened, and history has reset itself in its wake. The destruction gave birth to creation, not the other way around. But if the end comes before the beginning, then what exactly was destroyed, and what, if anything, was saved? Some versions of the paradox suggest a complete reversal of entropy, that the universe, rather than dissolving into disorder, reaches a critical point and then begins to contract. Not physically, but informationally. Events unfold in reverse. Civilization regrows from ruins. Time appears to progress forward, but it is actually the shadow of a collapse already complete. In this model, what we see as progress, technological evolution, societal complexity, emotional development, is simply the residue of a timeline folding backward from its final moment. To the traveler, this changes everything. They no longer see history as a path toward doom. They see it as a path from it. The ruins are not ahead. They are beneath the surface, and every step taken in the present is, in some strange sense, a step away from the wreckage that once was, and still is. But then, the paradox deepens. If the apocalypse already happened, and the present is built on its remnants, can the traveler truly prevent anything? Can you stop what is already concluded? Or are you merely living in its echo, rearranging the dust of something long settled? This creates a soft tension in the traveler's purpose. They arrived to avert an ending, but there is no ending left to stop. There is only aftermath dressed in the illusion of origin. And yet, this realization is not hopeless. It is clarifying. Because if we are living in the reverse of an apocalypse, then every act of compassion, every invention, every healing is not resistance to doom, it is recovery from it. Life becomes an act of gentle reclamation, a quiet reversal of silence, an answer to destruction already past. The traveler begins to let go of the need to stop the end. They begin instead to witness the regeneration that follows. They see time not as a countdown, but as a return, a cycle where what is lost is slowly, carefully reformed. In this paradox, time is not a threat, it is a balm, And even if the future is barren, the present is not. And that, perhaps, is the miracle. Because a reverse apocalypse does not erase the meaning of life. It redefines it. The end came. And still, here we are. Still building, still choosing, still healing. Not before the storm, but after. The looped technology paradox, tech with no inventor. Some things have clear beginnings. A blueprint sketched on a napkin. A discovery made in the silence of a laboratory. A spark of insight that changes the world. But in time travel, beginnings are not always easy to find. Sometimes an object appears without origin, a device without design history, a breakthrough with no traceable creator. This is the looped technology paradox, also known as the technology with no inventor paradox. It is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is an almost invisible contradiction, hidden in the lineage of innovation. But once seen, it is impossible to forget. Let's say that a time traveler brings a device to the past, a piece of technology decades, perhaps centuries, ahead of its time. Someone finds it, studies it, and begins to reverse engineer it. They develop it, improve it, distribute it. Years pass. That same technology becomes widespread. Generations later, a scientist working in the future stumbles upon the design, now common, accepted, unremarkable. They carry it with them during their own time travel experiment. And it is the same device, passed from future to past, from past to future. A perfect loop. But with one critical problem: no one ever invented it. The technology exists because it was brought back in time, and it was brought back because it existed. It has no point of creation, no origin in any single moment. Its design was never imagined, it simply is. This is the paradox, not because the technology is dangerous or even impossible to use, but because its existence violates causality. It creates a closed loop of information with no external input. A device that sustains its own existence across time without ever being born in any moment. The implications are quietly profound. If an object can exist without invention, what does that mean for knowledge? For progress? For the very idea of creativity? The traveler begins to wonder, what if all their achievements, everything they thought they created, were simply echoes from a timeline they didn't realize they were preserving? What if the things we admire in history were never discovered, but delivered? Not inspired by genius, but by recursion. Some theorists attempt to resolve this by suggesting the loop itself is stable, that so long as no contradiction arises, such self-originating objects can exist within the laws of time. But others resist this view. They argue that information, like matter, must come from somewhere, that a loop without a source is not sustainable, that eventually the loop must decay or collapse. Still others view the paradox not as a flaw, but as a feature, a glimpse into the strange resilience of time. That perhaps time, in its deeper structure, does not demand beginnings for every end. That some things simply emerge, like patterns in chaos, without a clear moment of birth. To the traveler, the realization becomes intimate. They begin to see themselves not just as a person moving through time, but as a participant in its maintenance, a custodian of things that may never have been invented, but which still hold value, still function, still inspire. And so, they no longer ask who invented the machine. They ask instead, what will it do? If it helps, it is worth keeping, even if its origin is unknown. In this paradox, meaning does not depend on authorship. Value does not require a name. Sometimes the gift is enough. And in accepting that, the traveler finds rest. They do not need to be the beginning of every story. It is enough to carry the story forward. to keep the loop alive, not out of obligation, but out of quiet care. And that care, steady and simple, becomes peace.